I'll book in the line says Basin on this meetings. Nice stream, a little bit of a pain, but we'll make it work for it. So I appreciate y'all being patient with me. I'm gonna go ahead and call the meeting to order. Take a look briefly at our meeting objectives. It's primarily going to be to finish our discussion on the draft management recommendations. Which I feel like they perfectly feel about Thursday, just kidding. And then they don't feel as pertinent. So we're grateful for that. We're going to look at surface water law, regulation, and policy challenges, and try to discuss some potential recommendations that we may include as part of our plan for safety Basin. They also want to try and look at our agenda in general. Everybody get a chance to take a peek at that in advance, or if not, any issues or concerns with it. Otherwise, I'm going to ask for a motion to approve the agenda. Motion.
Second.
Any opposed? Thanks. John sent out some draft meeting minutes and a summary last week of our last meeting. I have your comments on those. Otherwise, I'll look for a motion to approve the minutes and summary for our April 8th meeting.
I make a motion to approve the minutes from the April meeting.
Second.
Any opposed? Well, just briefly, a few other items for you. You can really go either direction to find the restrooms. They're going to be on this wall, down the hall between us and the entrance. There's also another one down this way, right and to the left, and you'll find the restrooms. We'll have lunch, kind of back room, also back to a conference here. So otherwise, if anybody has any questions about setting for this morning, just give me a shout.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Just a couple of newsworthy items before we start. There was a Water SC working group meeting on April 25th. There's another one coming up this Thursday. I just want to give you a quick overview of what was discussed at the 25th meeting. Tricia Kilgore from Beaver Jasper Water and Sewer Authority and David Bay spoke about South Carolina Water Reuse chapter, and Justine with Mount Pleasant's the current president of that. Yeah. So it's interesting to hear from Tricia. A couple things. Water Reuse chapter. That's a relatively new chapter in South Carolina. It's only been around a year and a half, 2 years. They've been working on and prepared some draft reuse statute, which is under review. So they work closely with South Carolina DPS. Reuse statutes, regulations, laws are done at the state level, not at the federal level. So each state has their own. So my understanding is they looked at Florida and some other places that have been doing reuse longer to kind of decide what we want to put together. Correct me if I'm saying correct item.
That seems like a reasonable statement, yeah.
They're also working on a marketing study and social media campaigns to kind of help understand how to build public acceptance around water reuse. Anything you want to add to that you're aware of, or I don't know how plugged in you are to what Justine's been doing?
No, I'm very involved. I was one of the founders of Water S, that group, the reuse group. Right now, I think where it's going to get the most traction with the indirect potable reuse, which people can get their head around a little better. So the injection to the aquifer, which DES is very supportive of, particularly where it can create a saltwater wedge and potentially prevent saltwater intrusion, if that is a concern. And also ASR, so aquifer storage and recovery, seems to be those two vehicles where you inject water and store it for later usage, and to inject into an aquifer seem to be where we'll get the most traction in the near future. And we'll save direct potable reuse for further discussion.
We also had a discussion, we had a breakout group discussion around water conservation and water efficiency. We're going to have a similar discussion sometime this summer. Look at the same thing, demand side strategies. How can we help conserve water? How can we improve water efficiency? So we're going to ask for you all to come up and to brainstorm as a group what type of strategies you support. We've been doing this at every river basin council. Water SC did a similar exercise. They broke out by water use sector. So the energy sector came up with a list of things. Conservation, recreation folks came up with a list of things. I'm not going to go through them here. You can see them on the screen. Water utility, they had their own ideas. Ag and forestry kind of brainstormed as well. And then industry and some. So just in summary, they said there is a need to incentivize and fund these conservation and efficiency strategies. That's one of the bigger impediments that implementing. And they suggested the state water plan should identify ways to incentivize these and help fund it. That's something DES will be considering as they craft the state water plan. Questions about it? There you go. What's on the agenda for this week's meeting?
And just finalizing the agenda there, I think there will be a discussion on the interbasin transfers. Kind of maybe a discussion on interstate compacts and how we work with our neighboring states might also be discussed. And at least those two.
All right, that was it for news for the items. Unless somebody else had any news for the items I want to bring to the table. Public and agency comment, any agency or public that are online, who might make comment? All right, moving on. Just a quick summary of what we talked about in April. We talked about drought response, discussed our obligations for Chapter 8 of our River Basin Plan with regard to drought response. As background information, we reviewed how drought response is handled in the state. There are 4 different drought management areas. They report up and form the drought response committee. Joe Kuhn represents DES on that committee, Social Ag, Forestry, DNR, Emergency Management of that as well. Within the Santee Basin, there's both the southern drought management area and the central. Jason, you're the only representative that's on our RBC that represents the southern DMA. We had to deal with this RBC that represents the central. We talked about how we want to communicate to the rest of the RBC, the public, and the stakeholders, provide information to the DRC as needed, and kind of came up with the approach that most of the RBCs have adopted, which is either communicating through the chair, the vice chair, or a designated liaison as drought impacts are occurring to make sure those are being recognized by the DRC and considered when they're trying to identify what drought stage the county.
The contact for SC, if the DRC's changed, to make sure to get that information or anything you need to update and training.
Okay, that's listed. Thank you. We pondered whether we needed a specific drought management or response strategy in the basin, similar to, as an example, the Edisto came up with their own. Since Santee Cooper already has a low inflow protocol, a contingency plan, we recognize that that is effective and applies to a good portion of the basin. So we had made the decision not to identify any additional basin-wide drought management strategies. Then we started to review some different recommendations that most of the other RBCs have put forward. One of them was encouraging water utilities to update their drought response plan or ordinance every 5 years or more frequently if conditions change. That's what approved by the RBC. We talked about another one, which some of the RBCs considered and approved, but not all of them, had to do with encouraging response actions in those drought plans that are consistent with neighboring utilities, so potentially avoid confusion. We decided that wasn't really something that was necessary in this basin. We didn't approve that one. But we did approve one that RBC should try to coordinate their drought response messaging. Then we've got a few more to talk about, and that's what we're going to discuss right now. So, the next one I want to discuss, which has been considered by most of the other RBCs, and many of them had a similar recommendation as the one you see on the screen here. The RBC encourages water utilities in the basin to consider drought surcharges on water during severe and or extreme drought phases. So not during incipient, moderate phases, but when the rubber really meets the road, and starting to have issues. The RBCs felt that having water utilities have a drought surcharge for excessive water use was an effective deterrent to limit water use. And I put Mount Pleasant's drought surcharge up on the screen. Tell me if this is not correct, but I pulled it from your website, so I think it's probably current. You'll charge the regular rate for anything up to 3,000 gallons per month, which covers pretty much normal use, right? Unless you're irrigating.
So John, interestingly enough, those tiers look weird to me, but if you got it off to my website, I need to go review them. So shame on me. But a typical tier one customer for us is 9,200 gallons. So that's non-drought, 9,200 gallons. When I first saw that, one of my recommendations was not to be so prescriptive. I like the idea of drought and tier charges, but I might define an REU very different than Jason does. So a typical monthly user gets one REU, that's a household, and I assign a gallon amount to that household ratio. So I would just be careful if we're making those type of recommendations for a region. So each utility may do that slightly differently. I think a tier charge is the way to go, and we do have that increasing block tier charge. But just be mindful of water usage, but for gallons is assigned balance.
I'm putting this up as an example. There's utilities.
It's really expensive, John.
Alan, y'all 300 GPD.
Yeah, exactly.
You're an REU.
Yeah, we typically see 50% of our users are captured at the 3,500 gallons. Our median number is 3,500 a month. In a typical family, I think the average is probably closer to 5,000, 4,500 to 5,000 for a typical.
We've been a part of a couple of utilities attempts to reduce the REU
Yes.
number. On North Myrtle Beach is now 265, I think. Meadows is 280.
Yeah.
Just long range studies to determine actual use.
Yeah.
Which keeps them from having to add to their water treatment plants as quickly as they might need to otherwise.
Yeah, we've seen that number come down too. I think 300 is a typical cleaning number with DES, but we're seeing 225.
That's what design for subdivision, this sort of thing, that's what we use.
Yeah.
That plus fire call.
Alan, you made the comment, those, it's kind of steep. Are you saying the 2, 3, 4 times the regular rates?
At the 3,000, yeah, at the 3,000 gallon. The gallons don't seem, that's very restricted.
I see.
We're gonna hit most people, in that scenario, we would hit most of our customers with the 2X. They'd fall into tier 2. Drought.
Industrial users are the one that get hammered.
Yeah, commercial.
Yeah.
Maybe during a break, check Dr. Bose, because I've got it easily.
That's probably in our drought plan. I don't have those numbers,
Okay.
but that may be accurate.
We had a discussion, I think, at the Upper Savannah RBC, Greenville Water. I led this discussion because they have just added a drought surcharge. Their ordinance, their discussions around, you can't just do it by like 10% or 20%. That's not really a deterrent. So people don't really care if you have to pay an extra 10%. So they made theirs similar to this, 2, 3, 4 times as much. Instead of really trying to deter, and they thought that was effective.
And that is the way our tier structure works. The way it is 2, 3, 4
Yeah.
on normal everyday charges. I would agree with you that this is easier to implement than 10 or 15% or 20%.
Yeah, Charleston has anything similar, Jason?
The drought plan outlines it all. I don't want to get into the numbers and be wrong, but I think most of the larger municipalities are going to have it within their drought plan to trigger some kind of rate change, especially if you go through the drought triggers.
In your careers, have you ever had to do that?
So Mike, that's where I was headed. We had a pretty significant drought a few years ago, if you remember. I mean, Tony, my water supervisor, was doing all he could to produce water. And we were clearly in a drought and we never implemented drought charges. So I think politically that is that would be tough for us to bite off. So I would, to my knowledge, no, never implemented drought surcharges.
I think, now that I think about it, that's how Greenville Water's drought surcharge works. It's up to the board. It's suggested at extreme and severe, we implement this, but the board has to actually approve and say, yeah, let's go to that. It's not an automatic trigger. What does the rest of the RBC think? Do you think that's a worthwhile recommendation? It's,
I mean, one challenge with a broad approach to this is, for example, Charleston Water, and the drought committee, and even within the DNR's drought recommendations are for water utilities to develop up-to-date drought plans that, yes, do trigger on the drought declarations, but more importantly, trigger on actual stream flow or reservoir levels pertinent to their sources. And so in our case, we're going to trigger certain levels of drought based off of actually low stream flows in our sources at historic givens in the reservoirs themselves. And based off those actual triggers being reached, we potentially do things like this. But to say that a broad southern drought management area or even a broad basin, because it's in moderate or severe extreme, wholesale implements something like this, when the reality is a lot of times stream, like we're in moderate right now, that is just going to hit flood stage in a couple of weeks. We're unlikely to go anywhere less than incipient in the next drought call. There's just no way we would go to a tiered higher rate structure unless the sources are reaching some kind of constrained trigger level. Frankly, we're nowhere near it.
How far upstream do you look? All the way to the top of the watershed?
In our case, we are looking at mean and median flows at Gibbons for that source and then reservoir levels for the two reservoirs we have. But we can project further up the watershed based, for example, on the Edisto, on Denmark and Orangeburg. So we get an idea of whether the river's in a way, going down or going up and that kind of modeling. But again, unless there's a constrained resource, there's no way we could justify increasing rates on our customers based off of a wholesale projection of the basin or drought management area. I mean, hey, we're gonna increase your rates. By the way, our reservoirs at full pull and the rivers at medium flows.
this isn't suggesting that the basin as a whole adopt this. This is your individual utility. So if your triggers suggest that you're in your own extreme or severe drought, then this will kick in for you. But maybe not for Mount Pleasant.
So the semantics are tricky. If we're going to say severe and extreme drought basis, people are going to automatically assume drought committee declarations. And so I would just say, yes, this is great, as long as it's caveated based on actual triggers of, the utilities, source waters.
We can make that clear.
And that would be a benefit to every utility and every basin plan across the state if drought plans were specific to the actual quantities of water available. It would show that everybody understands when we need to react and when we don't need to react. It works in both extremes of interest as far as managing drought.
Jason, I'm thinking about implementation for the utility. And so those triggers are very important. So if you rewind the clock, Tony, was it 2019? We were having a very hard time meeting demands. Now, there was a drought and our demands were high, but at the same time, I had infrastructure issues. Whereas if today that same situation hit, I wouldn't have the problem meeting that demand because we have taken care and shored up our infrastructure. So, and also, when we're selling that much water, I mean, truth be told, I'm in the water business. So, I mean, that's a lot of revenue moving through the utility. I think you need to be careful tying this to triggers because Jason's going to have different constraints than I have. I may be able to, in drought condition, I'm conjunctive use, I have groundwater, I have surface water. I may very well be able to meet our customer demands without implementing a tiered structure to reduce that. So I think those triggers, that wording is really important, and I think it needs to be left up to the utility. I may not pull additional surface water, which is what typically think of as a problem during the drought. I may make that up with groundwater use. So for me, that it may not be effective. Now, I know this group is thinking we need to reduce the surface water use during the drought. Well, I may produce more groundwater and my surface water stays exactly the same. And the meters are spinning and I might not want to restrict usage. Well, I may want to, but I might not.
You brought up early the political implications of doubling somebody's water bill, because that hits those who have the least ability to pay the hardest. So,
Yeah, that was the discussion in some of the other RBCs as well. It's not impact those users that have struggled to pay. So you have to set the rate up so that, you're only, impacting the folks that maybe are doing a lot of irrigation or filling their pool or something.
what if we just recommend that each utility develops their own and follows it closely instead of,
That's what the intent of this recommendation is. It's supposed to be utility specific. Not basin wide, but utility specific. And each utility is crafting something that makes sense for them and their customers.
Yeah, and one good thing about saying it's based off of not just the broad drought declaration of the committee, but based off of the triggers. And then obviously, if the triggers are reached, the board or commissioners in our case will weigh. And the reason I say that is because let's say the stream flows at Gibbons Ferry have reached our drought trigger. Is it time to curtail? Not if we can pull it from the two reservoirs. So, are you gonna accomplish anything by the curtailment? And in some cases, if you can switch to your contingent groundwater source or another river source that is at full pull, then there's no need, the board's not gonna approve a rate adjustment, emergency rate adjustment. But it's good to have it within the plan as a capability for when a real emergency is there and you've got the legal ability to enact that higher rate when needed. It's just when needed is the
I
caveat.
would think prior to doing this, you would be encouraging your users to cut back. You would use this as a kind of a thing like a threat, saying, hey, we may have to implement a drought surcharge if we can't get our demands down. So just that threat may prevent you from having to do that. But,
And we have pushed out like water on different days.
yes. Felicia, you want to give a comment or a question?
Oh, me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say that I agree with using some broad language that gives the utilities flexibility, but that this is a good tool and that it should be included. It should just be, utility specific. And that example, I wouldn't include that in the language because, and I don't know if that's what was being proposed, but um, yeah, I think that's it. I wouldn't include the example.
Okay, sure. Thanks.
But John.
Yeah. John, did you have a comment or question?
My question for the group, and I missed the last meeting, I apologize, but I do think this is useful language to include. And we're one user. Is this language also, is there going to be typical ag language? Or we're going to have different users? Is there going to be a drought response for each of us?
Yeah. We can talk about that. None of the other RBCs have proposed a similar recommendation for ag, because that's when the ag really needs the water, is when it's the dry.
Sure.
If they don't irrigate, then they're out of their crop. So it's been discussed, but no other RBCs have come up with a type of restriction on ag, with the understanding that they don't have water there. They've lost their product.
I would think even some best practices would be mentioned.
And we certainly have talked about best practices, ways to reduce water usage, even before a drought. So that's been part of the discussion. Okay, so I'm hearing that I think everybody's kind of behind this recommendation. We'll remove the example, but we'll still keep kind of the recommendation and make sure the language that supports the recommendation talks about that it's utility specific. Everyone comfortable with that?
As long as it talks about utility specific triggers.
Right. Okay, we'll make sure that's included.
Well, and you mentioned ag also. What makes this is for home use and not ag or industry? Is that what you're saying?
Well, this is specific for water utilities, and they could be providing water to industry.
Right.
Uh,
That's what I'm saying.
Now, this surcharge, as written and as contemplated in other RBCs, may not apply to industry. If you're like wholesaling a lot of water to an industry, it may
Right.
be a separate agreement. I think the intent of this is just for more residential use.
Does it need to say that somehow? Because I don't know if regular people are going to understand that that's for residences as opposed to ag or industry.
So I guess that's a good point. I think this restriction, in my mind, when you throw up a drought restriction like this and surcharges, we're all talking about irrigation, right? I mean, that's the only reason and the only group of people we're trying to Green grass is the
Yeah,
problem.
and when you say irrigation, make sure you're talking about like
Residential.
Residential irrigation, this
Yes,
is watering
not-
at your home.
It's not my cornfield.
It's not
It's
your,
not my peach.
but should it be your cornfield and peaches? Guess the question I have, these are for people that are watering their grass. That's the only reason we see it
Well, what else,
increase.
what else do people do to wastewater? Swimming pools, grass? What else happens?
I believe
What, slip and
that's,
slide in the yard? I mean,
washing cars.
washing car,
Yeah,
okay.
that's right. Car wash pools, but mainly I bet 90% of this is
Wait.
irrigation. of your yard.
Huge bursting industry of car washes. Everyone just get their ass to Tom's or Spinks or something and wash it there. You don't need to do it at home anymore.
Dirty car, just have a dirty.
$30 a month and every wash is free.
Right, free. And vacuum it out too, gosh darn it.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. Henry RBC has supported this recommendation, which has to do with encouraging water users and those with water interests to use a tool called the Condition Monitoring Observer Reports. Melissa Griffin, you're online. You want to talk about this? You certainly can. I'll kind of go to the website and show everybody what it looks like if they've never been there. But you're welcome to unmute and speak up.
Can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay, perfect. I can give a brief overview. This is this particular condition monitoring and reporting tool has been around since prior to 2019, but it wasn't really utilized until that point when the flash drought was going on in the Southeast United States. This particular tool gives you the ability to select a location and be able to take pictures and do a brief discussion of the current conditions that are actually on the ground. So there's two ways that you can use this particular tool. The one is being kind of demonstrated right now on the website. There is also a app that you can add to your phone to be able to do the same situations, but be able to do it while you're actually out in the field, taking conditions of whether you're doing, a quick look at reservoir levels, if you're agriculture, what your crop conditions are, if you're just even out doing recreation and you see some things that are like, it looks a little low here, you can put that information in. So this tool is done in conjunction with the National Drought Mitigation Center located in Nebraska, and they are also this data also ties into the U.S. Drought Monitor. It is one of the tools that the authors actually look at for more specific information and impacts when we are kind of on the fence about which way we're going to go with the drought designation for that particular week. So as you can see, the form is kind of easy. It's step by step. You can put it in. If you can actually go to where it says back to that tab where it says map of reports, you can click on that map. It'll open up this GIS tool. Give it a minute to load all the reports. You can do the year-to-date reports, and every single dot on that map represents a report that has been submitted. So you can see there are a couple of reports there for South Carolina, one up in Greenville right now, and then a couple of red dots that were up in Horry County. And if you click on one of the dots,
All right, I'm starting over because I got
that's okay. Yeah, it's okay. So yeah, if you can zoom back in on South Carolina and you can click on one of the dots that's available. Now this is probably, I would pick one of the ones like in Horry County. You'll see it tells you about the detail of the report. So when it was submitted, the conditions that the person was responsible for, and then if you can scroll down on, it should have, there you go, on the little report detail window. There we go. So it'll tell you how much experience they have in that particular, is it localized or widespread, what they're actually seeing. So this one, they were talking about dry lawns, they were talking about dead branches, talking about the fire impacts. But if you, there's also the ability to view images from the droughts. So I'm trying to think of maybe if you click on another one, maybe they've put in some images. There you go. There's a picture. So, pictures of conditions and everything. I've seen everything from people who have submitted conditions when we've been flooding with higher rivers. And then I know in 2019 in October when we were dealing with that flash drought, we had a lot of agricultural interests in pretty much across the state that were taking pictures of the damages that were being done to crops that haven't been harvested, bad soil conditions like cracked clay soils in the upstate, stunted row crop growth, low reservoir levels, dried up streams and everything like that. So every one of these impacts and having that detailed report along with those images can go a long way when we're making recommendations to the U.S. Drought Monitor to be able to kind of say, hey, look, the conditions that we're seeing in the data are not keeping up with the conditions on the ground. And like I said, it really came in handy with the flash job situation that we were dealing with, where the data was not keeping up with the amount of ET that we were dealing with, the above normal temperatures, and our lack of rainfall. So this is one of the tools. I do have a flyer that I can send you, Jason, if you want to send it to the RBCs, which has a QR code to download the app and some instructions on how to use the actual tool.
Thank you, Melissa.
You're welcome.
So again, it's a tool that's already out there. The recommendation that's been proposed is just to encourage more folks, kind of increase awareness of it, get more people to use it. Don't have any issue with that? Questions, comments? Anybody ever used it before?
I've looked at it to see what the reports are. I don't think I've submitted a report, but I do think it's a good tool, especially when you get those field observations in either direction, low water, high water, that kind of thing. More, pictures are worth 1,000 words.
Might have any issues to be included as a recommendation? Melissa, I don't know if you heard that. The question was, is the Seymour system widely used by the agricultural industry? And I feel like a lot of the reports that are submitted are farmers. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. Most of the reports that we do get are from the agricultural industry. However, if you look more towards the West and what's being some of the reports that are coming in from the West, it's everything from FSA agents, private citizens, reservoir operators, general public. I mean, this is a tool that can be used by anyone who's having impacts of either drought or flooding in their area and wants that information to be noted and looked at. So, but we really do see a lot of use based on the agriculture industry.
Farmers have a lot of stake, and most big farmers have crop insurance. So you need photographic evidence of damage, flood or drought, in order to collect on crop insurance. So
Yes. So crop insurance does come into it. The other part of that is with livestock, with those who are responsible for like rangelands and livestock, you cannot insure pastures. So being able to take that photographic evidence and send it to whichever state body or however the U.S. Drought Monitor process is being done in each state, so that information can get up to the U.S. Drought Monitor is really important because then we're able to capture that on the ground, and there's different levels. I don't know if Sam is in the room or if he's online, but there is, I was gonna say USDA has a couple of programs that trigger based on the USDM's designation for duration and intensity that can help, those livestock producers when situations get bad.
Yeah, there's certain triggers that stage at D2. I think it's 4 weeks at D2. 1 week or 2 weeks at D3, and then as soon as it hits D4, it's immediate trigger. And each of those triggers are going to be a certain amount of payments. It might be 2 months, it might be 4 months, but that just allows for a little bit of payment to come in, because a lot of times when they're in drought statuses like that, a lot of our foraging grass is pretty well dried up, so they're not getting hardly any production. So you're not getting any good protein, any good digestibility off that forage. So it allows them to supplement some feed to those animals and recoup some of that cost. It's by no means gonna be the silver bullet, but it just kind of crutches them along.
Okay. All right, thank you, Melissa. We'll include this then as a recommendation in the chapter. The last one that wanted to show that's been discussed and approved by all the other RBC that Steve there. It wasn't mentioned, I think, Jason, when we did the EDISTO. It's a recommendation or a request coming out of the climate office at that time, but it has to do with funding and establishing a mesofield network of weather and climate monitoring stations. And Melissa, do you want to speak to this very briefly? I don't want to put you on the spot. I didn't give you a heads up. Do you want to kind of describe what it is? And I can show the North Carolina example if you want.
Sure, you can go ahead and kind of go through the North Carolina example. So the Mesonet is, it's the talk of it has gained traction here in South Carolina over the last few years. And it is a pretty robust operating system. So this is beyond the capabilities of like a simple Davis instrument, Davis weather station or a Cook-Ross rain gauge or a Tempest station. And they're usually operated by either a state agency or a university to collect data. And this data can be in near real time, 3 seconds or less, and it can collect a variety of different meteorological and derived observations. So that's going to be wind, rain, temperature, humidity, solar radiation, and then these particular stations also have the ability to add in sensors for soil moisture and soil temperature at multiple depths. So that can be anything from 6 inches in the ground to close to 4 feet in the ground, depending on if you've got enough ground to dig that deep. So these mesonets are recognized by NOAA, National Weather Service, and the National Centers for Environmental Information as being high quality. So they have a pretty substantial footprint and a pretty substantial price tag with them as well. But there is a lot that you can do with these particular stations. We have one that we have, the Sassafras one, which they're showing right now. That one is owned jointly by SCDNR along with the North Carolina State Climate Office. It's the only Mesonet station of this particular brand in the state of South Carolina. So the price tag for one of these stations can run anywhere from about $20,000 to $30,000. It sounds like a lot, but it's a pretty decent investment. There are some states that have one of these stations in every single county, and then they pull in additional information from like the Tempest stations, the Davis stations, and the Cook-Ross stations to kind of help supplement and fill in those gaps. Really good when it comes to drought monitoring, severe weather monitoring, and even heavy precipitation monitoring across the state. So South Carolina is currently one of a handful of states that doesn't have a statewide Mesonet. I do believe just this past budget year, the state of Tennessee has allocated $4 million for the development of a Mesonet station, a Mesonet network in their site. So this was one of the recommendations that also came out of SCOR's resilience plan a few years ago as being a top priority for the resilience plan that they issued. I think that was in July of 2023, 2022. Everything runs together after COVID.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah. Scott.
Melissa, the $20,000 to $30,000 price tag, is that the startup cost? That's not the recurring cost, though.
No, that is just the instrumentation cost. That's everything from the individual sensors, the tower, the fencing, the server, the modem, because these stations are cellular and solar, so they're kind of off the grid. So in the event of like a hurricane, these stations can still operate. Then I put together a cost estimate, but I think for us to put 46 stations in the state of South Carolina, so that would be one in every county. I think the estimate was about 1.7 just for the infrastructure, and I think it had a reoccurring cost. So that reoccurring cost was about 800,000, so just shy of $1 million a year. That's everything from hiring people to help maintain the program, quality assurance person, a program manager, but then also, the data plan, the servers, maintenance on those particular sites as well.
And follow up. So that cost estimate including hiring additional climate office staff to maintain those sites?
That was correct. Yeah, the additional 800,000 a year to $1 million was for that. The idea is that we need at least 3. It would be nice to have 5 additional people to help run this, because the other person that I didn't include in that would be an IT specialist who could actually create the interface and a forward-facing website that would kind of similar to what was being shown for the North Carolina Econet. So you're pulling the data in, but that person is also able to help create the decision support tools for some of the derived products for different stakeholder needs.
John Grego had a comment or question. Is the network built from scratch, or can existing stations be incorporated into the network?
So there are a couple of different flavors of Mesonet, I guess is a good way to kind of put it. So if you look at something like Oklahoma Mesonet, they've been around for over 30 years. They're using the same standardized stations across their entire network in the footprint of Oklahoma. I know in talking with the Tennessee Climate Office, what they're looking at doing is putting in these big scientific grade stations and then incorporating in some other stations that exist through open API. So there'd be different layers that could be toggled on and off, but there would be caveats with the fact that, you know, the one layer would be just the Mesonet stations, which are maintained and calibrated regularly, versus having a layer that would have any additional open API networks. So that would include like, you know, all of the different personal weather stations that people have that we can pull from, like Weather Underground or from Tempest, Weatherflow, and those would be kind of in there as supplementary data to those networks. There is a very high standard to meet that scientific grade for the Mesonets. The American Association of State Climatologists has put together a best practices document on creating Mesonets. These are lessons learned from those who've been operating Mesonets for 30 plus years on, you know, kind of a guidelines for making sure that you're creating a network that can sustain. And I see that, I was going to say, I see there's a comment. Yes, Georgia also has a Mesonet. Theirs was started with smaller towers, more like tripods, and I believe they had just gotten some state funding to put a lot of theirs on these hardier towers that are like 10-meter towers. So they'd be in line with the same instrumentation that other Mesonets use, but also the instrumentation that's used by the National Weather Service.
Okay, any questions about this? Don't understand it? Do you think it's needed? Do you not think it's needed?
I got a question. I'm just curious. So pretty substantial, but the capital cost doesn't bother me as much as the O&M cost bothered. Yeah. Pretty substantial O&M on that. Question for you is this data not available already in the private sector? I mean, through, like you mentioned, weather flow, there's a lot of people doing weather, but there's nothing of this caliber. Is that what we're talking about? It's just, this is a different level.
This is a different level. So for example, the WeatherFlow Tempest stations, they are wireless stations. They have to connect to a Wi-Fi network, which means that you have to have a Wi-Fi connection in order to have this station communicate. So if you wanted to put this out in the middle of like a field or an open area, or let's just say you wanted to put it in the middle of Ace Basin or something like that, it has to have Wi-Fi access. So if it doesn't have Wi-Fi access, it's not going to be able. So this particular station runs off of a cellular modem plan. So it is constantly updating data. They can be put in remote locations. They run off of solar. So again, but they also have multiple cycle solar rechargeable batteries. So you have a battery backup, so they can't, when they're not running off of solar, they can run off of those particular things. Unlike the Tempest station, this particular type of station can be built into a configuration that is suitable for any and all stakeholder needs. So like for the Tempest stations, right now, they have no way to integrate any type of soil moisture monitoring with a Tempest station. These particular stations, you could put up to I've seen up to 5 or 6 different soil moisture levels when I worked with the Kentucky Mesonet for a bit. We were running 5 different soil moisture levels and temperatures on top of those stations. So in addition to that, we were using a weighing rain gauge, which was able to basically give you 1-minute rainfall rates. We were using multiple solar radiation sensors. We were using wind sensors at multiple levels. We were using temperature sensors at multiple levels. We were able to compute evapotranspiration. We were looking at leaf wetness sensors. So you can build, we also had cameras on them too, and the cameras could use infrared technology for vegetative health. So those that were located on farms, we had a couple that were actually located where we had some livestock producers who had given up land for us to put the mesonet stations on there. We had cameras that could actually look at the pasture levels and through infrared be able to tell us the extent of dryness that we were looking at in the cameras. So there's a lot, it's like you can kind of put what you want sensor wise on these bigger mesonet stations than what is available through some of those other networks that already exist. I know that there are a lot. I know WeatherFlow has been looking at trying to get into the market of creating more sensors that are more of that scientific grade for mesonets. Davis Instrument is doing the same thing. Understanding that, beyond just like if you were to go on right now and, Google personal weather station costs, like the $200 to $1,000 weather station, they're looking to try and develop weather stations that can do more than what they currently have out there. But I don't know how far off those particular prototypes are from what currently exists out there.
Any other questions of this? What do you all think? You think this is a recommendation you want to make? Yeah, go ahead.
It seems like this is recommending funding to establish it, but not maintenance. I just like to make that language just to refer to maintenance will be important for long-term use. So it just might be important to have that wording in there.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, I think the intent wasn't for it to include funding to maintain it, but we need to be specific. So, does the RBC generally support this as a recommendation? You have enough information that you think you can get behind it or not?
I guess who would implement this? Would it be DS, DNR? Who would?
It would be DNR and the state climate office. They would be responsible for it.
They have.
Okay. Well, if no one's opposed to the recommendation, we'll include it in there. Is that okay? Okay. All right. Those covered all of the drought response related recommendations that other RBCs have developed. Doesn't mean that y'all can't come up with your own. If there's anything else that we haven't touched on, so this would be your opportunity. If there's something that's on your mind about drought response that you think should be a recommendation for the Santee Basin in our plan, now's the time to talk about it. Anything else comes to mind?
My only statement would be, again, we've singled out water utilities, which is, I think that's a good idea. I would like to see language, and maybe it doesn't specify ag, but it specifies that all users review best management practices. Just seems odd to me that we're going to make a recommendation for a particular sector and leave everybody else alone during drought.
Meaning just residential, not ag, not industry.
Ag and industry. I think ag and industry needs to review their best management plans, whatever they are.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're doing it, it just seems odd to me that we would only have utility sector referenced.
What do y'all think?
Bring in a big industry that's a large water user. Department of Commerce, everybody's involved in getting them to come here.
Yeah.
It would be good when they come to have rules established. But if we get into a drought, then you gotta cut back, but I don't know how you would implement that.
Well, it might be part of their decision-making on coming. What are the rules? We know we're using a lot of water.
Well, and with ag, because ag's the easiest for me to get my head around, but it could be industry too. I'm not even suggesting that they cut back, but maybe there is a different irrigation practice that they would implement. I get it. You need to keep your animals, your livestock, your crops alive. Um, but we're asking our customers to take action. I would think that industry as well as ag would also take action. I'm not sure what it would be.
Between a lot of Clemson Extension, SC State Extension, water research and irrigation research, there's a ton of advancements within ag, precision ag technology. We've got producers using variable rate irrigation. We're selecting crops based on drought resistance, especially with the severity of these recent droughts we've had. We're starting to pick some varieties that are more drought tolerant. We've got several marketing order boards that are looking into research specific to drought resistant crops within the state of South Carolina. Because no offense to an Iowa corn crop that's drought resistant, it doesn't perform as well in South Carolina soil because it just doesn't. So it needs South Carolina research to get South Carolina varieties. There's a lot of that going on right now. And then two,
I would think this would be a great time to highlight that.
yeah, and Clemson also has a center pivot program where they'll go through and audit your entire center pivot and make sure that there's no nozzle leaks, there's no leaks in the system, there's no water loss going on, above a certain threshold. The water resources agents are doing great jobs.
I think even including links to that, to water audits, and just, again, I guess it just feels like we just picked one sector and said, here's what you do in your drought, but we've left off other sectors.
Do we need one recommendation for ag that's vague enough for you to feel comfortable with, but says, hey, we're not gonna use any more water than we have to?
Yeah.
And then one for industry that says, hey, we're not gonna use any more water than we have.
Right.
It's included but vague, safely vague.
I think encouragement of best management practices and
Right.
like, that's typed right there is general for all. And like I think John said in the past is, ag, we don't like irrigate until we have to. Because again, the water's not cheap. It's the power.
It's power.
Whether you're kicking in a diesel pump or kicking in electricity
Right.
to run that water, it's very expensive to run irrigation. And when you do that, you cut into the bottom dollar, and no one likes cutting into a bottom dollar, especially when we're already being 5 different ways.
Exactly.
There may be other farmers that don't know or understand or have access to or could learn about things that about, that they'll see the link and they'll go, wow, didn't know that Clemson had this program.
Yeah. I think they would know something.
Yeah, one thing, I think all the river basin councils, when they've got to the meat and the potatoes portion of the plan, there's a little bit about what about me as going on, which we can all relate to, right? I mean, hopefully these plans are encompassing of all the stakeholders, or they're not going to be very valuable plans. But how do you protect those that need protected versus account for those that are really, really large withdrawers, whoever they may be? And so, there was quite a bit of debate in some of the other councils about small farms versus really, really, really big farms. Put whichever in quotes name you want to apply to them. And then, not all industry is the same. You've got small industry, you've got very, very, very large, modern, certain types of industry that are becoming more prolific across the state. And so, in addressing our drought management strategies within Edisto, which is analogous to what we're talking about. We're talking about who should have best management practices, who should have drought plans, substantive drought plans. And I would argue the bigger they are, the more important it is for them to have a real drought plan. The bigger they are, the more important it is for them to have some kind of contingency. You shouldn't be expecting some small industry or mom and pop farm to dig a well if their overall use is like 0.001% of the resource. But if you've got some really big farmer that's maybe for our drought management strategies, I think we used 3 MGM is the regulated amount, 3 million gallons a month. And I think we used, was it 20 or 30 MGM?
I don't remember.
The important thing is we chose a number, not the regulated amount, but what would constitute a really big withdrawal? What would constitute a withdrawal so big it's to that entity's best interest and it's to the basin's best interest that they develop real contingency, too big to fail. Things that they could implement both best management practice wise for general conservation, but also like when the resource is actually restrained, who is gonna bear the brunt of resource management? And if you're 30 MGM or more, or whatever we potentially decide, we could argue, at least within the confines of our non-regulatory recommended plan, that those entities that big have a drought management plan. It might not be able to be in the law or the regulation, but we could absolutely make such recommendation within this council that, hey, if you're this big, whoever you are, doesn't matter whether you're industry, water utility, ag, if you're that big, for your own sake and for the sake of our basin during drought, you need to have a drought management plan. And if you want to be really resilient during drought, you should have to have contingency if it's available. And we had certain stakeholders within some of the other basins that were not legally required to develop contingency because they recognized it was in their best interest, both politically and as far as resiliency during drought. And if you're that big and you say, I can't curtail, then you develop contingency. That's what water utilities do. If we don't want to have to, at the whim of every drought, curtail and increase rates on our customers, we probably should have a more resilient supply. And this is a question not just applicable to water utilities.
The big difference between industry and farming and ag is that industry can cut back on their use, lay people off. It doesn't kill the industry. If you cut way back on the water consumption rate in ag, you kill crops, you kill cows. So it seems that to me that the focus should be on more on industry than on ag.
Well, and I'm not suggesting curtailment of ag. Let me rephrase this in a shorter, more concise way. If they're that big of an agricultural user, they probably should have a secondary source if they're within the aquifer. They don't pull off that aquifer until they need it. But if their surface source is drying up and they're within MIF, whether they're confined to MIF constraints or not, it would be helpful to the health of the basin that they were able to pull from a contingent source if they're that big. And I would apply that to any user, again, regardless of who they are. I'm just talking about well building, contingency, if it's available. If they're above the whatever line, the fall line, thank you, that's not going to be an option. But if they've got 2 or 3, aquifers in good shape underneath of them, and they're a multi-million-dollar entity that is not a mom and pop, but spreads across South Carolina, has operations in other states in the United States, and potentially international footprints, they should be able to dig a well.
My fault with these are recommendations. That's where I come from, right? We're not, these aren't dash shouts in DHEC language. These are recommendations and a guidance document for your sector, my sector, the different sectors. I like BMP's best management practices. This is a toolkit. We're going to give you some advice. And I think under the BMPs, you could put bullets to everything Jason outlined. This is develop a contingency plan, different sources, the links that, for, ag audits. I think all that's really useful information. And their best management practices. It's not, thou shalt do this, because I think we all know we're not going to get there. But recommendations, bullet points with information in it. Jason brings up a good point. It's the big gorillas that move the needle, and I get it. But oftentimes the biggest gains is the small ag guy that doesn't have the resources, and he's running at 80% inefficient because he doesn't know how to manage that right. So
you don't think there should be a threshold? You think all water users should have to?
That's my opinion as a South Carolina.
Best management practices, no matter how big you are.
That's correct.
Right? 'Cause
Right.
You're right. It'll all add up.
Yeah.
Every little bit, but then
But-
over a certain threshold, certain users having like a drought management plan.
Yeah, recommended BMPs for everybody, right? And the resources through Clemson Extension and others to make sure that they get that.
The list goes under here instead of just the water sector.
Correct. But if you're talking about if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in a well investment, if you go to a certain aquifer, it can be substantial. Not gonna change, and we don't want some mom and pop ag entity to go get a well that they may never even utilize. But if they're a multi-million-dollar, very large,
They're going to do
some
that anyway.
threshold, 20, 30, 40 inches,
Yeah.
whatever you decide, You say they would do it anyways, you'd be surprised how many haven't. But this idea that everybody needs to be a responsible steward, and the bigger you are, the more responsibility on you seems to be common sense.
Yeah. Would agree.
So we're gonna have a whole meeting, maybe more, focused on water management strategies. We're gonna go through by sector. We're gonna decide, make recommendations about, ag should be doing this. We've got a whole list that the other RBCs have considered. Water utilities should be doing this. Industry should be doing this. Energy should be doing this. So that'd be a great time to continue the discussion we're having now. We can list off specific items and encourage this toolkit of BMPs. So I'm gonna suggest that we defer this discussion to a later meeting when we have that water management strategy discussion, which we'll document in chapter 7 of the plan. That sound okay?
So that's just the VNPs though, but to what, Jason was saying of like certain water users over a certain threshold, having the drought management plan similar to like the water utilities have. I think that's what
Yeah,
might be
and I
helpful
would,
here.
I would argue, and we can look into it, but I would argue that the largest users in the basin already have drought response plans, mainly the utilities. Santee Cooper has their contingency plan, which covers the reservoir operations. Outside of that, I'd have to go back and look and see how much the industries are using and if they fall within the top tier of water users.
But I think that's kind of the crux, and we'll get a chance to talk about, like you said, if we defer. But when we get to regulatory and legislative recommendations, it ultimately gets into the three user groups: ag, registrations versus permits, grandfathered and new. Who has drought plans? Who's required to have drought plans? Are they substantive? And I think ultimately you could argue within, and if we do the BMPs within our recommended plan, but I do think there's some warrant to a legislative regulatory conversation around if you're big enough, develop contingency.
How big is big enough? Again,
That's it, in some base, well, I think that is the only one that developed any kind of criteria about what defined big, right?
Yes.
And it was either 20 or 30 MGM. Out of approximately, throwing out numbers here, out of approximately 100 withdrawals, it applied to about 5% of those. But it covered 80+% of the resource, which is my point. It's the Pareto effect. You ask the 20% of the largest impacting entities, you're going to get 80% of the gain, and you save 80% of the withdrawals that have the least impact on the resource from having to unnecessarily spend resources to do this thing, even if it was funded by some other funding framework. But I think this is a conversation to be had within the River Basin Council, and then a larger conversation to be had with groups like Water SC, if agreement can be made about legislative or regulatory recommendations. But I think it's going to be those kinds of, if you're big, whoever you are, you should have to have contingency that helps us get to a reality of not dividing people up into different criteria. And then when the drought happens, certain people don't have to do anything while other people have to do everything. Kind of, it's not very equitable, and it's not protective of the resource.
You say, when you say contingency, are you, I guess specific to ag, are you referring to reduced water use?
No, back to if they're big enough, we would recommend within our River Basin Council that they develop contingency groundwater availability. So if they're on a surface source, they should have groundwater wells as a backup during drought.
You've already kind of mentioned it too, but surface water or ground use, who's gonna pay that money for them to seek another alternative water source? Because
if they're big enough, they would themselves, same way that utilities have to self-fund.
Right, and a bunch of them do, but that's, that might be a 10, 20-year plan. Is it going to be a recommended time frame they have to have it done by? Like if they're primarily drawing kind of 50-50 surface water, groundwater, is there a recommendation that they shift to 70-30 by a certain time frame? Or?
No, it would have to be generalities within this plan recommendations, right? Because it could be different for each one depending upon where they are within the groundwater resource and surface water resource. And that's why when we get to the recommendations that we're deferring to, we want to make a suite of toolbox recommendations for people to follow. But at the end of the day, their plans will be truth and specific to the trigger, specific to them for where they fall in the fall line, things like that.
And it's still a very slippery slope too when you're talking large users, family farms versus large farms. I mean, statistically, we're nationally, we're 96% small family farms. In South Carolina, we were much higher as far as small family farms go. So it still falls in on a singular family to have to upfront those costs and yes, they may be a multi-million dollar or, multi-million dollar corporation, if we're going to use that word, but at the same time, they're paying, brothers, sisters, cousins, other workers, other community folks that are there. So for them to have to upfront that cost of drilling a new well or losing land and putting in a surface storage area, that's a big loss for them.
You got another issue too. It's not just the capital cost of building the well. You get a drought, can't just run out there and drill a well. That's something you've got to have in place as a contingency when it happens. And you're going to get a power bill for that pump, whether it runs or not. So there's an ongoing cost to owning a well that even if you never use it, you're going to get a monthly bill from your power provider for capacity costs. So it's expensive.
Yeah, let's look at who's big enough. Is it 30, 40 MGM? And then, looking at data around what is from the ag group about what is big enough, et cetera. How do you avoid hurting those that really do not have the means? It's just all a conversation to be had. But I think at the end of the day, instead of being utility versus ag, which is the way it always gets framed, it should be win-win-win. It's in that user's best interest to have a backup if that resource, that surface water resource, is truly reaching below minimum midstream levels on a regular basis. And there are points within the basin that is occurring, and we're going to model how that will happen in the future. And to look at this model data and not respond to it in advance is a disservice to the modeling and the planning that we're doing in order to protect the resource. It's also protective of each of our interests, whether it be utility, industry, power, ag. It shouldn't be one user group pinned against another.
Jason, I keep fighting to see that we can revisit it later. One last comment.
I just want to ask you a question in relation to these upfront recommendations ranking. How do they relate to the more specific ones? So upfront, if we've talked about residential people, do we need to talk about industry and ag? You said that later we're going to be more specific about industry and ag. But how do these connect to the more specific recommendations we're making that you just mentioned that we're deferring to later?
Yeah, so
You said
so we're we've got our drought recommendations that are going in chapter 8 of our plan. They're specific to drought, right?
Okay.
Some of the stuff we've been talking about leading over into water management strategies, which is demand side kind of reductions and using water more efficiently. So I'm deferring that conversation to what's going to be documented in chapter 7 of our plan, which is a big picture. Here's how we need to be more efficient with the water that we use, regardless of whether it's drought or not. Okay. So that's how that kind of moves over there. Jason's kind of talking about something that bridges both drought and policy and regulation. And I think I'd like to hold on to that and hear from Leanne and hear from Joe and let you all get a bigger understanding of current policy and regulation, how it works, how it doesn't work. And then we can potentially revisit Jason's idea, which do we need to recommend any type of regulation on large users to encourage them to build resilience, what that might look like. So it's good that he's planted that seed, but let's talk about that once we all have a better understanding of regulation, policy, law, and what it covers and what it doesn't cover.
So you don't think we need to say something specific about ag or industry in chapter 8, referencing drought?
Referencing drought. Personally, I don't think we need to, but we can always revisit this.
Okay.
We have the option to come back and revisit the recommendations that we've made once we've got a better understanding of all this stuff.
And I think we do need to. I think we'd be a misstep.
The big picture in drought,
We're
right?
talking about all three of these. Why would we only talk about one in a chapter? I
Right,
feel like you need to talk about all three all the time. That's the main.
right.
That's what I'm doing.
Even if you're vague.
Even
right,
if
we're
you're
not-
vague, even if it says BMPs, I mean, I feel
Yeah.
like we would be omitting the other two groups. We all impact drought. When there's a drought, we're all thinking about it. So why would we not reference that in chapter 8? I think that was my only point.
Okay, that's a good point too.
No, I get it.
Right.
It's all gotta connect.
But it all has to connect. Discussion on water management strategies, and then we can decide if we want to supplement that with additional language in chapter 8 that focuses on drought and how these apply to drought. And we'll put that in the parking lot and come back to it. A little.
It can really protect our farmers and our industry.
Oh,
Yeah, putting that in, you guys are the ones.
On this discussion. And I
I
didn't
get
make
more
the point
tools for
that
funding
at the
that
moment,
it
electric
Yeah,
utilities
I know.
are considered
Right.
non-essential
Just make them more resilient.
of water during drought. If the grid goes down,
We need to change that. Oh, you're not essential?
that feels like something that might need to change, because we're at a point where we're net importer of power already, and if we get to a point where we're having to implement water conservation measures, we're gonna be doing the best we can to do so. But without the grid, you don't have wells to pump.
We're talking about the power grid.
You don't have water utilities providing water to people who need it in their homes.
Isn't that when we have to go to your secret government place built in the 40s and get that one thing whipped up and then all the other things start with like this much power that you were telling us?
But,
Last time we were at your place.
yeah, but then you just want to make that point, that feels a little concerning, at least at the stage in the state's history, knowing that we're kind of in a critical from a capacity perspective. I think it becomes a real issue if electric utility curtailment to the point that the grid becomes unsafe.
Okay, we're running a little bit behind time. We can take a quick break now or hear from Leanne, which is 25 minutes. No long questions or answers. Do a break after Leanne, or do you want to do a break now? Anybody?
Leanne, are you ready to go or do you want us to take a break?
I'm fine on the way. If it's not helpful to you, but yeah.
Good forward.
Let's move forward. Okay, Leanne?
Do you want me to go around?
You can do whatever you want.
Will that work from here?
Yeah, sure. I think.
Like screen.
There you go. Yeah.
Look at that. Awesome.
So we have a quick preface. So Leanne's going to talk kind of a big picture overview of surface water law and regulation. Hopefully you all had a chance to review some of the information I sent out ahead of time. That way you've got a head start on it. Water utility folks and others already know this pretty well. Leanne kind of hit the highlights.
Yeah.
Joe's going to follow that up with some of the challenges. Policy, legislative, and regulatory recommendations. There's a lot of recommendations that have come out of the other RBCs that I want you all to consider. And it's going to take some time. I mean, we've spent probably 4 or 5 meetings and other RBCs, especially like the Saluda, talking about just this category of recommendations. We don't have the luxury to do that in this basin because we're on such a abbreviated schedule. So we're going to have to kind of go quickly. And I'll talk about how we're going to try to do that. But for now, listen to Leanne and then Joe after the break, and then we'll dive in and try to get through as many recommendations as we can following the approach that I'll explain. Leanne?
And if you have any questions or need clarification while I'm going through this, feel free to interrupt me. And I'm sorry if I'm still a little froggy from whatever this was. So I apologize for that. Yes, I'm Leanne Monroe, manager over water quantity permitting. So ground and surface water. I know you heard from Ashley last meeting, right? Talking about groundwater. So
Maybe it was 2 meetings.
2 meetings ago. Okay, so now I'm going to just talk about the surface water side of things. So as you heard from Ashley before, our groundwater use reporting program has been around since the 70s. We issue permits in designated capacity use areas, and those are essentially every county in our coastal plain. And these are users that are using at or greater than 3 million gallons in any month. Anyone outside of a capacity use area, so essentially that the northern part of the state, upstate, if you use greater than 3 million gallons, you still register and report to the department. And then everyone, once again, reports their water use to us. Same with surface water withdrawals. We have the same threshold for permitting or registration, which is 3 million gallons in a month. This is a statewide program, so regardless of where you are in the state, you get a permit or registration. And this has only been since 2012.
They've been reporting information.
Yes, people have been reporting for much longer, but it was all voluntary. Our best data is probably 2002 for surface water. But since the laws, we kind of had a jump in reporting due to increased adherence to the law, right? So surface water laws passed in 2011 is the Surface Water Withdrawal, Permitting, Use, and Reporting Act. The regulation was promulgated next year, and it established that system and rules for permitting and registering withdrawals. Once again, this is for any user withdrawing up to that threshold or greater in a month. And this is not an average over the year. This is in any given month. So you could just be using, like a lot of times with ag, of course, you're only using 6 to 8 months of the year, but they still need to have a registration if they're using that 3 million gallons in any of those months. And then, as Jason kind of alluded to, we have 3 different types of withdrawers or categories. We have existing, new, and agricultural, which are considered registrations. And they each kind of have their own criteria. Look at how they're registered with us. In order to determine permit volume or registration volume, once we get the application, we review it, and part of it is this safe yield calculation. So the safe yield is the median daily flow minus 20% of that median daily flow, or 80% of the median daily flow. And we calculate an adjusted safe yield, which we take that safe yield number and then adjust it, including any upstream or downstream withdrawers. And when we look at these existing withdrawers up and downstream, we're looking at their full permitted or registered amount. So we're not looking at their average withdrawal or highest withdrawal. We actually look at what they're currently permitted or registered for when we do this adjusted safe yield. And this is done for only new permits or registrations. Existing permits were established a different way. And then as far as registrations go, as soon as this safe yield is developed and whatever they're requesting is within that safe yield number, they're deemed registered. So an agriculture user would then be deemed registered.
Yeah, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Not to slow you down, but just so I understand, you get into the Eastern and Western water law type philosophies. When I read adjusted for upstream and downstream withdrawals, that's saying that prior rights, existing allocations.
It seems that way, but it's more, we're just trying to make sure that when you put in your straw, it would actually be available for you. So it's not just to protect like the downstream users, it's also making sure that, hey, there are these people upstream of you. Is this even going to be here by the time it gets to where you're trying to put in your intake?
But if I have an allocation, existing rights, and let's say that you're requesting something that now falls below your comfort level, so the MIF, I guess, are you
Well,
gonna?
and that would be for a permitted user. We can get into that in a second, but for just talking about safe yield. So we have had a case where an ag user came in, requested an amount, we calculated a safe yield. What they requested was greater than the safe yield that we calculated. So we just send them a letter, contact them, we say, hey, you requested this, we actually calculated the safe yield to be this lower number. And then they just came back and registered for that lower number or whatever the safe yield was at that point. And it's because it's calculated at the point of withdrawal and it's on the day that you do the calculation, it changes through time. So it's kind of, it's kind of weird how we have to do it, right? So, I'm just doing it on the day that I do this, usually when we do this, we use stream gauges that the USGS, has out there. And the goal is to find stream gauges with 30 plus years of data, but that's not always available because we're trying to get gauges that are in the same basin, have same geography, they're in similar areas of where the intake is, right? And so then we have to kind of make a calculation to assume that the flow at that point of withdrawal has the same type of inflow that stream gauge has, that we're using as a reference gauge. And so it's not an exact science, right? But, we do our best with the information that we have. And a lot of times we do have to look at multiple gauges to kind of get a rough idea of what would be at that point. But yeah, we are trying to make sure that we are looking at what's upstream so that if they do pull their full registered or permitted amount, there is something coming to you that you can grab. Now, for registration, we don't consider minimum entry flow. That's only for new permits. So if you have you're coming in as like a new industry coming in, right? They would get a permit and we would have to do this 20, 30, 40 minimum entry flow calculation, which is, it's each month is different. So January through April is that 40% of the median daily flow for minimum entry flow. May, June, and December are 30%, and then July through November are that 20%. So in those summer months, it's only that 20%, which is just like the safe yield. But essentially, when we look at that minimum entry flow number, if what they need, a lot of times that could be greater than what would be theoretically available during that winter time, like that 40%, let's say. So that means that this new user needs to have that contingency plan that we've been talking about, right? So they either, maybe they need to purchase water from a water utility, maybe they need to put in a well, maybe they need to have on-site storage. But those are the types of things that any new permit would need to have in the case that this minimum stream flow is not being met on site. But that, once again, is only for new permits, not registered users. Does that make sense?
How are the upstream and downstream flows measured and where gauges? Where are they?
So when I talk about upstream, downstream, I'm talking about like, so if I'm looking at an intake here, like a proposed intake, when I'm doing the adjusted safe yield, I find a reference gauge, I calculate the safe yield using the flows from that reference gauge. And then when I'm looking at that point of the proposed withdrawal, I'm looking upstream of there to see, are there other intakes that already exist and what are their permits for? And that's what I'm looking at. So I'm not looking at necessarily like the flow in each of those intakes. I'm just looking at, okay, what is that person's permit limit? What is their registration limit? Okay, I take that out of what is
Available.
Current safe yield, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And we find that that's a fairly conservative way to do it, because if you think about it, let's say I had a gauge station at the same place that I'm proposing an intake. Gauge data is just, the flow through of the gauge, right? That inherently includes any withdrawals or discharges because it's just what's flowing by.
Right.
So
It's still there.
So taking out that of those upstream users, it's just giving us a more conservative estimate of how much water to be at that point.
Can you calculate mean annual? Like, what's the period of record you're using?
It's whatever is at that gauge. So we
Okay.
find, yeah, so let's say I have my intake here, but my gauge is somewhere else. So, but I still, that's the reference gauge that I have. So it's whatever that length of time is. And like I said, we try to get ones that have 30+ years. So we kind of capture different climate conditions. And we're also able to use the SWAM model that CDM Smith developed as part of that. We can throw a virtual intake or gauge at the point of our proposed withdrawal and see, how that would impact downstream users and that sort of thing. But it's just whatever that stream gauge has as its record. So with existing withdrawers, so these were users that existed or were planned by January 1st, 2011. And they were issued for the largest of either their historical use, permanent capacity, capacity of their intake structure. And the capacity of the intake structure is what I believe most, if not all, users were permitted for. They were not public notice. They are not subject to those minimum stream flow requirements. And they do have a requirement for some type of drought plan, but it's very minimal, and it was just for the essentially best practices for that type of industry. And then these were issued for between 30 and 50 years. So these permits they're still on their first iteration of their permit.
So there's a public notice required now.
For new permit, yeah,
Okay.
that's, yep. Good point. So if you're a new permit or a new industry, coming in, you need surface water, you will be public notice. It's a 30-day public notice requirement. If there's an interbasin transfer component, so withdrawing from one basin and discharging into another, there is an automatic public hearing requirement. These new withdrawers, these permits are evaluated for reasonableness. So if you come to us with a new permit, let's say you're an industry, we need to know what are the best practices for your industry? What are you reducing? What practices, what best management practices, like Jason was talking about, are you planning to implement at your facility? What drought plans do you have? Once again, we calculate that safe yield and the minimum industry flow values during this assessment. And these are issued for a 20 to 50 year duration as well. Typically on the 20-year side, you need to have some kind of reasoning to have that greater than 20 years permit limit. And then when doing these new permits, if their request is greater than the safe yield, they are required to have additional contingency planning, which is especially important for the minimum industry flow requirements, meeting those flows. But the contingency planning allows for, once again, if they have on-site storage, if they plan to cut down production during drier times, if they plan to, if they have a well, something like that. So, but they would include that in their application to us.
Leanne, just to highlight that last box.
Yeah.
I have a problem with that last box as a groundwater user. So surface water, 20 to 50 years, and groundwater user, 5 years. So I feel like that's something that, to me, that's a recommendation, that there's just, that those don't match up. So.
Yeah, and we've heard, when people hear about, if they are only surface water users and they hear about groundwater duration, they are shocked.
Yeah, because these are equal investments, right? Your infrastructure investments are equal if you're a surface water or groundwater withdrawal. And so you put in a $20 million well and we have a 5-year permit.
That's a good point.
Yep.
Alan, where is that?
So groundwater permitting is on a 5-year cycle.
So it's not on this slide. You would have heard about it when Ashley talked a few meetings ago. So, yeah, so groundwater, it's not on this slide, sorry. Yeah. I'm just talking about surface water, but yeah, groundwater is important to kind of bring into the conversation because, bringing up with contingency planning and other things, so. So as far as agriculture registrations go, once again, they have the same threshold for requiring to be registered. But they have no minimum industry flow or reasonable use requirements. We just calculate the safe yield at the point of withdrawal, and if the request is within that safe yield number, they are deemed registered. They do not have expiration dates, but they are not able to be transferred. So something I didn't mention with permits can be transferred, but they can only be transferred for like to like. So if you're a water supplier and you need to transfer an intake to another water supplier, fine. You can't do it across type uses. However, with ag users, they cannot be transferred. So if someone, say, we've had this come up, someone sold their farm to somebody else, well, they had to get a whole new registration for their site because you can't transfer that registration capacity. And just in general, statewide, we have 199 active permits with 257 intakes, 114 registrations with 218 intakes. But in the Santee Planning Basin, we have 26 permits with 31 intakes and only 10 ag registrations with 13 intakes.
So are those existing permits, when they get renewed, are they subject to new renewal? Oh,
No, that's a great question. So whenever we get to a point where we are renewing these existing withdrawals, we actually, they have to be issued for the same volume that they were originally permitted for. So there is not necessarily a mechanism for us to be able to reduce a permit during its renewal time.
So they're lifelong permits.
Yeah. Compared to other basins, are we like high, low in terms of like active permits and registration?
Pretty slow. I mean, as you can see, it's pretty low. I mean, especially with registration, I mean, 10 out of 114, that's pretty low.
Are they reviewed at any basis of period of time, or is it just?
Permits? Or, so not really. Permits are subject to, so this is something I also didn't mention. Permits are subject to an annual fee essentially. So there is so registrations don't have any cost associated with them. However, permits have, if you are a new user coming in, it's a $7,500 application fee. So just for the application, not necessarily you're getting the permit, that's just the application. And then there is a $1,000 annual fee per intake. So let's say you have 3 intakes, Jason does, they pay $3,000 a year to keep those intakes active. So, yes.
Samantha. How many new permits, how many new
Right, yeah.
registrations on average do you get per year?
So I would say we definitely get more ag registration applications coming in than permits. I would say, but we don't get a lot. It's really not a lot. I mean, I would say ag registrations. I know we've done 1 new permit this year, so 1. Ag registrations, I mean, we've had years where we get up to 5, 6. So it's really not, the thing is, a lot of people, because they came in as existing, they're already there.
It's probably important to point out, I think they've only done 8 new permits
8 or 9, I think.
in the history of the
Yeah.
program.
Yeah,
8 new.
I would say maybe 9 now.
So
Probably 9.
97% are
Or
grandfathered.
maybe grandfathered in.
So
So,
not only are they grandfathered, but what you just told me is there's no mechanism for future reduction or future
Correct.
restriction. So while it's a lifetime permit.
essentially, and I mean, a big thing too is, we talk about how protective, that minimum flow can be. It's only applicable to those 8 or 9 permits.
So
Because-
realistically, not to take the wind out of our sails here, but you just told me that 97% of all the permits are existing users. They're gonna renew automatically whether you like it or not.
They don't even have to be renewed, it's just there.
What are we doing?
Well, they do have to get
Like, what are
renewed,
we
but
gonna
yeah,
do
there's not
for
much we should do about it besides, reviewing it.
So we're really only talking about recommendations that are gonna apply to 3% or any new permittee in the
And-
future?
But I will,
Is that, I mean,
I'll-
that's a fair statement.
Unless the council wants to recommend a change to the
right,
policy.
and I'm sure y'all will get there.
I just can't imagine, I get being grandfathered in, but being grandfathered in forever.
And
Just doesn't
And I
make
will
sense
make
to me.
this caveat that, let's say you're a grandfathered user, but then you want to get a new intake with an increase in withdrawal, that new increased amount is subject to minimum initial flow requirements. So
But only that portion.
just that portion, yeah.
Oh, so it doesn't revert back to the entire.
No, yeah, so, like, let's say you have a permit for 100 million gallons a month and you need to increase it to 120. That 20
Is all.
is subject to the minimum initial flow requirements.
Okay, can I review? The permits are people who have been here, they're grandfathered in, they don't have to report, they don't have,
No, they have to report. Everyone reports.
everyone reports,
Yes.
but registrations are new people who've been since.
No. So we had a lot of registrations that were already voluntarily reporting.
Okay,
And so when we started the program, essentially everyone that was already reporting to us on the ag side, we contacted them all and said, hey, just get registered with us. This was, your max use or whatever it was historically. We're gonna add this 20% buffer to it. That's what you get registered for. If that sounds good to you, then great. And then they were registered. That's basically what happened with all there. So we have a large portion of existing quote unquote ag registrations as well. We do have a lot of new ag registrations, but they're still considered registrations. They're not like new permits.
And this renewal, help me
We
understand.
haven't done a renewal yet.
Yeah, but help me understand legally that it's a policy or that's a law?
It's in the law and then we expanded upon it slightly in the reg, but
It's in the law,
it's in the
they're
law.
renewed as is.
Yes,
There's some language that says it, okay.
yes.
Yeah, and there's been some discussion in some of the water SC meetings, and there's been discussion in some of the prior river basin councils about could the legislation and the regulation around water withdrawal allow there to be a change in the volume, a decrease in the volume permitted at the renewal period. As it is right now, even if the withdrawer said, hey, we planned on doing this amount of withdrawal, it never came to fruition. We just don't need that much. We need, let's say, 2/3 of it. My understanding is there's just flat. not a mechanism for reducing, I've been told, reducing that
It's,
withdrawal.
it would be pretty hard to be able to do that.
If I had a permit or 1,000,000 gallons a day for a golf course.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to give that up,
I mean, there is that, but,
That's kind of the biggest
even though I
thing,
wouldn't
yeah.
use
That's a
it.
huge thing, yeah.
Yeah,
but you've also got other, so you got the ag registrations, you've got the permit, existing and new, all three different criteria. And we're talking about 5 or 10 year renewal periods for ground, 20 to 50 or 30 to 50 for surface, and lifetime for ag. And one of the challenges with ag that were brought up in the Edisto is there was a particular entity that took up a big registration volume that, to my knowledge, has never withdrawn and may never have any intention of ever withdrawing because they had other intentions with said registration other than withdrawing and for irrigating. And so there are potential ways of abusing the semantics within the law and the regulation by certain users within all three of these criteria groups, and that's a challenge.
yeah, and I'll point out, Joe's gonna talk all about those challenges in his presentation. So we can get a little bit more in the weeds with that when you have your slide.
Okay, one question. But did you have a comment?
Yeah.
She kind of answered it. I was just wondering how many of the permits were existing, like in the Santee were like existing.
Oh, in the Santee?
Yeah, all of them. So there's been no new permits in the Santee.
No new permits in the Santee.
Back to Mike's point, I'm the golf course guy. I have 1,000,000 gallons. My golf course closed down because whatever, they built houses on it. I can take my 1,000,000 gallons and
Well-
give it to you because you own a golf course nearby.
If a golf course closes, but like, it would have to be the same intake.
That's, oh,
So,
same intake
yeah,
structure.
you can't just give that to somebody else. So.
But if it
you're-
is the same intake
If it's the
structure,
same, yeah, so if, let's say your golf course closed, you put a bunch of houses on it, and that intake's not gonna be used anymore, that permit just goes away. And we
Right.
have had one of those happen. it's a golf course.
but if
Not
I
in the same
maintain my,
team,
if I maintain my intake structure, I maintain my 50-year permit and I can trade it to you for some cash.
Yeah.
No?
I mean, if, and because there's other things that have happened that's kind of becoming a question. But once again, it has to be like for like, so it would have to be a different golf course.
Mhm. Yeah, it has the same industry
Yeah.
type.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, if there was another golf course next door that was like, hey, I could use that increase, I mean, you could transfer it to them, but you could, broker some kind of business deal, but that would be between y'all. We would have nothing to do with it.
But it would
We-
maintain
we-
that
we would just-
existing permit. It would maintain as an
It
existing
would,
permit.
yeah, it would just be transferred to
Be
the other
transferred.
user, and we just need a 60-day notice for transfers.
Okay.
Keep
There's
that,
been about 35 golf courses closed in Myrtle Beach that turned into residential developments.
Yeah,
But I don't know of any of them that didn't shut their wells down.
that'd be a
yeah,
unique
and a lot of
situation.
those use wells, so
Yeah.
that's, and, those can be trans.
All of them, the ones at Barefoot, we've got pumps on the waterway, but very seldom use the wells.
Yeah.
John had a question on one end.
Sure.
Agriculture, does agriculture include aquaculture?
Yes, it does include aquaculture. And we have,
Demonstration.
yeah, and we have a few of those, not a ton, but yeah, that does include, that's part of irrigation.
Is there a background as to why ag can't transfer? Like if it even if it changes ownership, it's still arguable.
Honestly, I think it just had something to do with when they came into the writing process of being part of writing the law. And whenever they promulgated the reg, the portion in the reg talks about transferability of permits. There's just no mention of registrations anywhere. So, and it's not in the law either. So the assumption is, it's not even mentioned, so they can't be transferred.
Yeah, I'm
No,
curious.
and I agree with you. I think it's strange as well.
I mean, I know a lifetime permit sounds like a long time, but average age of the US farmers
Right,
is 60 years old, so they're not gonna be farming forever. They may lose that permit within 10
right.
years.
Like I said, someone just gets a new registration
Right.
or, so that is an issue. And that would be something, once again, that could be a recommendation for a policy change would be to allow registrations to be transferred alone.
Write that down.
Yeah.
Not on the council.
This is my last slide. There's just a few exemptions. Those include, less than that 3 million gallon a month threshold, completely self-contained ponds, dewatering operations, wildlife management. Hydropower plants are exempt from getting a permit, but they do have to report to the department. And then emergency withdrawals, which you would just call us up and let us know what's going on if an emergency withdrawal is warranted, and then we would just like to be aware of the situation if that was happening.
Wildlife management, so DEFCON, everything else besides DEFCON.
I can't think of anything else. That's kind of that's the main thing it's used for.
Now she's got a question.
Another question.
Yeah.
So, the annual flow, like with fluctuations that we're seeing, like precipitation and drought, would the median be more protective of stream flow versus annual?
That's a great question for Jason.
Yeah.
I don't think we've allocated enough time today to go into that.
No, but
Don't get Jason started on that yet.
Yeah.
You have a slide later, we'll
Yeah.
consider that recommendation, but I'd be surprised if we get to it today, but it's there, so we'll talk about it.
Median mean.
All right, if there's no other questions for Leanne right now, let's do a short break. It's 10:51. We'll break until 11, and then Joe will follow up starting at 11. Those rooms are down. Okay, so Joe's gonna talk about a few case studies to kind of demonstrate some of the challenges that have historically occurred.
I get reach out.
The law and regulation. And I gave some handouts as well that look like this. The same discussion was had by Water SC early on in their process. December. Yeah. That's why you see Water SC on here, but
Change that. That way it's not like.
hopefully you had a chance to read these and you kind of understand what some of these issues are, but Joe's gonna walk through them all. They're pretty straightforward and simple.
Yes. All right. So thank you all. Glad to be here to discuss this today. Great opportunity for me to meet you guys and keep this process going. As John said, this presentation was first given back in November at one of the Water SC working group meetings. And at that time, we did provide these handouts. I suggest you kind of read through those and follow along as I go through each case study. And the way we did it that day is we kind of did the industrial case study, and then we had a discussion. And I'm not suggesting we necessarily do that today, but feel free to stop me at any point in time if you guys want to flush something out. And I will say that, DES is not necessarily, these are just challenges that we've observed in practice with the regulation the past decade. We're not necessarily advocating here for any policy change, just basically trying to state the facts. But I will say that these challenges could be applicable across the state, and even the industrial challenge is something that we likely have seen a couple of times to date and will likely see in the future. So they are real examples. They are either brought to us by the Chamber of Commerce or whatever that may be. And we've evaluated each of these scenarios, and we haven't received a permit application per se, but we have at least evaluated and had conversations with these folks through time. So again, as we go through these case studies, if there's any recommendations that come to mind, just keep those in mind, and we can have a further discussion. So we'll move forward. Okay. Okay, that's not good. Okay. So this first one, really, again, it's something that we've probably evaluated at least a couple of times in my time with DES. It's where an industry is looking to locate, and there's several areas across the state where they have certain sites where they're trying to attract industry. And at this particular site, groundwater has been stressed. And so, we evaluated the surface water use there, and it was readily available and accessible. And just kind of an illustration there, we have a new industry looking to come in, and we have existing permit in place upstream of that new industry. And so in this scenario, and we kind of flushed this out in a little more detail on the handouts, this new industry would be subjected to minimum midstream flow, where these existing industries would not. This new industry would have to have a contingency plan. And so in times of drought or water stress in that surface water system, there's some uncertainties for that new industry and giving them the confidence that they would like to see in locating at this site. And one of those challenges is, they would have to get contingency in place. Likely that would look like having some groundwater wells in place. And so even with those in place, there would be limitations on those because it is an area of stress. And so again, I think this is something that we are going to continue to see, and it may be worth considering contemplating policy changes to, provide some certainty to new industries wanting to locate in our state.
So have you seen realistically, are you seeing a pushback, or have you felt it that this is even a problem? I would think, to Jason's point, if I'm building a 20 MGM plant of any kind, I'm gonna have contingency plan because I'm a good planner. I mean, does this matter to industry? Or do you get the feel that like this is a burden?
Well,
It's prohibitive.
These types of industries, groundwater tends to be their preference because it's comes up at a consistent temperature, consistent quality. They can build a treatment system around that and use that. When they contemplate using surface water, there's usually a bit more adjustment to that surface water that needs to be made to make it feasible. But beyond that, I think the uncertainty with having to implement their minimum midstream flow requirements and their contingency plans when users around them or below them, above, below, wouldn't have to be doing that. I think that's what, in this specific scenario that I was involved in, it gave them that uncertainty and didn't give them the confidence to locate there.
Right, because inside the box, people can do whatever they want to,
Right.
causing outside the box people to have to make adjustments, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Then you also conversely say that the safe yield and MIF are accomplishing exactly what they were intended to accomplish, which is if you're gonna have future constrained resources due to ever allocation of the resource, who should feel the brunt of a constrained resource during drought? Somebody that's been there for 100 years or somebody that's been there for 2?
I think that's certainly how the law is structured.
So, I mean, it's easy to say more new folks, bad existing folks, but there is a reason why the law was written the way it is. Because if you're gonna hand out 20 more slices of pizza on a 12 slice pizza, who should fill that shortage? It should be the new users, not the existing.
I mean, that's one way to look at it.
You get some folks at the Department of Commerce that will argue vehemently against that, though, trying to attract new industry to the state.
Well, I think.
But I agree with you, big water users are gonna prefer groundwater. And maybe surface waters are secondary.
Sure, maybe surface water is that conjunctive use, that contingency use that would make them feel more comfortable. But even in those times of need, the uncertainty of how other users on that stream have to adjust, or the failure of them to adjust, and they have to, that makes it a little more challenging to locate.
But at some point, you have to acknowledge it's a finite resource that has to be managed well during drought.
Sure.
And the legislature isn't always good at acknowledging that point.
Right.
Yeah, was there any proposals by the Water SC group? I'm trying to remember that to resolve this?
I don't think they were able to come to a consensus.
But you told us the ideas, Russ.
I mean, there were some discussions and ideas at the table. Not anything that rose to the top or came to consensus. Yeah, so this agricultural case study is something is one that I think most everybody's more familiar with. Where, you know, farmers are seeking a new registration or to increase their limits and are unable to do so because the safe field's been used up certain reaches of the stream. So.
Can I ask you a question? So these registrations and permits, you're going on what the requested use was, which could be imaginary. Right.
For ag, yes, those are not, they don't have reasonable use criteria, so for ag, they can just request anything.
Right.
There's no like, on groundwater side, for instance, you would have to say, this is what I'm planting, this is the acreage that I'm irrigating, all of that.
Right.
Surface water, we don't have to do that.
Right. Right. So we could be restricting something based on an imaginary number that has not even happened. Because we don't have the capacity, if someone's not going to withdraw, to have an elastic, we need an elastic box. So that, to Mike's point, you can get your water back, but you can also say, hey, it's like dealing at a card game. Okay, so we're only going to use this many, like I'll put my cards in and somebody else can take these cards. Where's that program? Is that just so unrealistic? Like you're saying, it'd be very hard to manage.
Yeah, well, there's just no mechanism in place for us to do something like that, especially on the ag side, because you can't transfer it, you can't require like reasonable use or those types of things. So it's just whatever they request.
And you can't in 1 year do this and another year say, I need that back. Exactly.
Not really.
So that'd be more like a cap and trade program, which I think would be ideal. But we're a long ways from something like that, but that's in my mind the way to regulate. And
Well,
I buy units from you and I sell units to you and market figures it out.
right. And maybe they say, well, we're not using this right now, but in July, oh crap, I need that back.
Right.
Right.
There's.
Well, ag already has that understanding that, they're only using it for, some months essentially. And this example is just talking about only other ag users as well.
Yes, when we evaluate these new registration applications, we have to consider the fully allocated and registered amount.
Right.
So that's the challenge in working with current policy is
Sure.
it doesn't allow the flexibility.
That's right.
So, yeah, I
Very
mean,
hard to do.
as the discussion pointed out, these ag registrations are not subject to reasonable use criteria. Basically, if within the safe field, it's being registered. And several registrations have taken up that entire safe field in certain regions. And so, new farmers can come in, but they would have to get a permit and be public noticed and go through that reasonable use criteria, minimum stream flow calculation, and be subject to all that.
And cost.
And the cost currently, as structured, the cost.
Yeah.
Yeah, they would have a contingency plan, all those things would have to be in place.
I think I have a question. So the new structure with getting a new permit, you're basically bypassing this existing registration that has tied up all of the same field in the river. Well, I with no intention to use it just to protect the resource, but to bypass that effort, you can now get a permit as long as
You meet the minimum stream flow requirements, you have contingency planning, and they would have to pay for that $7,500 application fee, which for a lot of farmers would not really be accessible to them, plus the $1,000 a year fee for their.
And there were some concepts that came out of the PPAC in years prior that contemplated some of these issues to allow some flexibility. So there has been discussion. Again, we're just trying to present these challenges and see if each basin can build any consensus on recommendations, and we're doing the same thing at the state level with RSC.
Has Water SC addressed this scenario? Like, I mean, have you gotten any buy-in?
Again, there doesn't seem to be any consensus coming out. Because this was in November, and at that point in time, we created a report to be pushed forward to the Surface Water Study Committee. And we couldn't get consensus from that group to really.
I think some of us watched that.
Wasn't that the meeting you were at, Jason? The November one?
I mean, the water SC meetings, whether the public, they're all public, but whether
Right.
the public meetings or the working group type meetings. But the more interesting one was the water SC DES briefing to the legislators, what is that group called? The
Surface Water Study Committee.
Yeah, but anyways, I encourage you to watch it, but,
What date
it
was
gets to
that?
this point that there's been some challenges reaching consensus from water SC.
Right, because I watched that one that you were at the meeting.
They had a river basin count, I mean, the water SC meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. So then we'll look at water supply. And again, I think this is a case study that could play out, especially along our coastal regions and coastal plain of the state. As we move through time with our population grows and more demand on our water supply, trying to assist water suppliers in flexibility. And so this was where a municipal water supply system would have liked to increase their supply where grandfather permits exist, by transferring an industrial intake to a water supply intake. So that's not allowed. But we did work with that water supplier to evaluate this potential. And so what we also found that reservoir was over allocated. Even though if you'll see those grandfather users, their permit volume, their actual use is a good bit less than what they're permitted for. But again, we have to evaluate that new user, that new permit based on current permit volumes. So can't be transferred over allocation. So that's a big challenge for, I think, water suppliers, especially in the coast, to meet growing demands and, build resilience into their systems. So that's something
I know I
that,
sound like a broken record. Was there any buy-in from water SC on this case study?
I don't think we've been able to really document any consensus.
On any of the cases?
No, on any of the case studies.
Regardless of consensus, were there things that were thrown out there? What were like the suggestions, even if they didn't build consensus around them? What was suggested from the group?
I didn't come prepared to summarize that, but I don't know if there was any. We had to go back and look at that.
Are there certain dates that, I know you put those, there were links to watch those, were there certain dates, I know I've at least watched one of them, and they had the thing with the sticky notes, up.
Right.
The woman was like trying to get people
Yeah.
to agree to, like, this is the yes sticky note, the green one, like, and like, I don't know. To your point, I don't know what dates, should
So
we go back?
November, this information was presented.
November 28th or something?
Yeah, I mean, we only have once a month, so the November meeting,
That's my birthday.
yeah.
November something. I think.
Right. And then we might have furthered that discussion in December. But, any consensus recommendations that come out of Water SC will be included in the state water plan, along with any recommendations that come out of these individual basin plans. And so the goal is just to hear from each basin, as to what recommendations they may make. And then also hear from Water SC, and then roll those up into a state water plan.
So this is unresolved, Joe. This case study you presented us, there's no resolution.
Unresolved. I think this water supplier will continue to pursue resolution of this.
Be a legal action, or is that what you mean?
I'm not sure. I mean, it continue to explore options.
Right.
It's the reason behind the inability to transfer from one type to another.
Yeah, it's kind of the same.
Law and reg are very specific that have
Yeah.
like transfers,
I think it's in the reg, but not the law.
which that could be a recommendation once again.
I definitely always think it's a good idea that recommendation doesn't go beyond the law. But I think one of the concerns, I think, with all of these scenarios is you end up with these nuances, the language, either within the reg or the law, depending upon the different situation, case study that we're talking about, there's disconnection between the reality of what's actually happening or what actually needs to happen versus you're bound up in the law. And one of our concerns that we brought up in the Edison River Basin Council that I would bring up in this council is partly due to the language in the law and the regulation, but also due to the math utilized in the law and the regulation, both behind safe yield and MIF, not getting too deep into that now, is you end up with the law and regulation overly constraining in places where there is abundant resources. Like 4 to 5 times the amount withdrawn is there, but it's not available.
Because it's already been allocated.
Oh, that's right. Or it depends on the different situation. Like we got multiple situations across the state. In some cases, even the total allocation is only a fraction of that which is available. But because of the way that the law forces you to not look at the big picture. And so you've got those situations, but what I think should be even more concerning to our council is you've got basins where you truly are currently on paper fully allocated, and MIF is our minimum in-stream flow is already an issue, let alone looking at shortages, projected shortages 50 years in the future. And yet in some of those cases, there's an abundant resource available based off of the law because shortage is being taken to zero. Because, you know, if you're not subject to MIF, you can withdraw the last drop in the river system. And there's talk due to the pressure to expand industry, ag, and all this into maybe not constraining safe yield or MIF, but you know, changing the language to free up more allocation, where allocation is actually kind of constrained. In fact, you'll hear many people say there's a paper shortage, but not a shortage in reality. And that may be true in certain places across the state, but the reality is there are certain places across the state which are already constrained and certainly will be over the projected horizon. And it's not in anybody's best interest, withdrawing or non-withdrawing stakeholders, to drain a river down to zero.
Well, an example of where that's been taken care of is in sewage treatment. Every utility, you know, you'll reach an 80% capacity on paper. You've got to start your plant expansion work. When you hit 80% in reality, you've got to be ready to move into an addition to your plant. It gives you that difference between paper and real. It seems like we could do that here, but a lot of this is self-reporting. It's the honor system. So you'd have to meter stuff. It would be a daunting task to go out and actually determine what people are actually using versus what's paper.
I mean, I think when I say paper versus actual, I'm not talking about a discrepancy in accurate reporting or nefarious reporting. I think most of all the withdrawing groups do a good job of implementing best practices to report accurately and honestly. What I'm saying is when you're talking about the amount of water available, questions around like what's been permitted registered versus what's actually withdrawn. But of that reported withdrawal, I think I would argue most, if not all, are within 10% accurate on the meter, probably or a few percent off. It's just this idea when we're talking about policy and you're using math, or are we talking real withdrawals or what you've been permitted on paper to withdraw?
Yeah.
And
That's the point I was trying to make.
And some of those user groups are withdrawing a third or a half of their allocation, and then there's others withdrawing a substantial less of that, and then there are some withdrawing zero of that under all three of the various, you know, criteria groups: registrants, grandfathered, or new. And the law's not really allowing us or the reg really a chance to fix that.
I think that ought to be a recommendation for this group, is to figure out a way to at least put a Band-Aid on that or come up with a fix so that you've got actual quantities instead of.
It doesn't.
I
mean, the kind of solution I would think is putting everyone under
the same umbrella, putting everyone to have a permit, even if it's before, the Surface Water Withdrawal Act of 2011. Something that has been talked about in like the conservation community and the PPAC and I believe it was discussed in like Water SC and is having, everyone under a permit, those permits lasting for 30 years and evaluated every 10 years based on reasonableness of the use. And everyone would have to meet the same in-stream flow standards. Simplify it. Everything is way too complicated right now. And, it's our job to basically understand it. I can't imagine how like a user would feel trying to understand like what they can withdraw and what they can. It just needs to be simplified and bring everyone under the same umbrella helps accomplish that.
The lack of evaluation is concerning to me as a citizen of our state. That those permits aren't evaluated on some reasonableness criteria every 20 years.
I keep going back to golf courses, because that's what I know. But when you're building a golf course, it takes gallons a day for growing it. But once you've grown it in, you come back dramatically.
And actually on the groundwater side, we do account for that. So we'll have, like, if a golf course comes in and gets a well and a permit from the groundwater program, we're able to, okay, we'll give you your permit for this amount for the growing period. And then at your first renewal, at 5 years, we can reduce your permit limit because we know you're grown in now. So
But this hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So I know when I got
On
the well for tap water in 1989, it was a 1 million gallon a day well.
on the groundwater side, yeah, we have,
Do you?
yeah, we'll have conversations with them and we've done that.
Yeah, you obviously have a mechanism for restriction on the groundwater side. I've lived that. But it's just discouraging to me that there's no vehicle on the surface water side. Yeah. And so that just seems so strange to me that they're not evaluated for reasonableness. And the fact that they just auto renew and that's in the law. If this group doesn't recommend that as a change moving forward, I'm just surprised me because you have to ask yourself, what are we doing? If we're not,
Well,
if we're not,
it can be a phase
what are
change.
we
It could
doing?
be 1 year, like, it's not all at once. It can be phases. You could phase that.
That's what I said when they expired, they would follow the new criteria. And I think what I'm learning today was that no, forever. Why call it a 30-year permit? It is a forever permit because it's just going to auto stamp and renew. So it's really not even a 30 or 50-year permit. It is a timeless permit, right? I mean,
I never understood why people didn't just buy forever stamps when they came out. They were recording since then. We should have bought 30 million.
Time value of money too.
Time value of money. That's forever stamps.
Hi, yeah. Yeah, I had put in the chat just a comment about the Southlands Fisheries facility on Cedar Creek, just to give, it's just another little case study about what they're permitted for versus the actual withdrawals. But I just wanted to add the context. I've been involved a lot with land development code in Richland County, and perhaps it's like this for other counties as well. But when you start talking about new land development code, and there's just so much taken off the table at the very beginning. Properties zone or properties that are used for agriculture, silviculture, mining, single homeowners under 2 acres. That's all taken off the table right at the bat, whether you're talking water quality buffers or new stormwater regulations or whatever. And so, it's just kind of like, no matter how good the reform, it's doomed to ineffectiveness if most of the land in the county is exempt. And so, I mean, I would just kind of second the perspective I'm hearing here about the really bright line in this case with respect to surface water withdrawals. I mean, that's I've heard of NIMBYism before, but this is almost like an extreme example of it, where the grandfathered uses just have so many more privileges than the new users. That's all.
All right.
Okay, that brings us to actually starting to talk about and debate some of these policy, legislative, regulatory recommendations. In previous river basin councils, especially at the beginning with the Edisto, this happened kind of naturally and organically. We didn't have anything to consider, so we just started from scratch and we talked about what was important to the RBCs. For the Edisto, that was different than the PE and the broad. But as we worked our way through 5, 6, this is the 7th RBC, we kind of relied on, for expediency's sake, some of the recommendations developed by previous RBCs as a starting point for debate. And that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to go through recommendations that generally have been, there's been commonalities. And hopefully you had a chance to review what I sent out earlier, but it's this document. There's a table here of previous recommendations, it's a box chart. And from that table, you can see where there was consensus or where there was a majority vote about a lot of these different topics, like reasonable use. That's the first one we're going to talk about. And there was generally really good consensus on that one. So we're going to work through those and talk about them. The way we're going to do that is using a bucket approach. Think of it like a stoplight too. Stoplight, buckets, or whatever. We start talking about it, we see there's a lot of consensus. We're going to say, hey, it looks like everybody's good with this. Let's memorialize this as a recommendation and move on. If there's debate, and that debate extends for amount of time that I so declare is too long, we're going to say, you know what, we're not going to solve this at this meeting. Let's think about it, let's sleep on it, and we'll come back and pick it up later. It's obvious we can't become consensus. We're going to put it in the red bucket, and we're going to move on from that one. Now, what does coming to consensus mean? Remember we talked about consensus is you can live with it, right? You might not be 100% behind it, but you're willing to say, okay, I can live with this. I might not get everything I want, but I can live with it. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about these. What most of the councils have done when we've debated recommendations, especially this category of recommendations that deal with policy, is they've tried to come to consensus where everybody on the council can live with it. That's been the majority of the time when we've agreed on a recommendation to be memorialized in the plan. But sometimes the Edisto and some of the Saluda's recommendations, they couldn't reach consensus, but they felt it was important enough that they wanted to vote on it. And if it passed by a majority, they included it in their plan and they documented this passed by 2/3 majority. And here's the reasons why some folks didn't vote for it. We documented it that way. But it's up to you all how you want to handle it. You may decide, like the broad did, that if we can't come to consensus, we're going to include it in the plan. The Edisto said, well, we still think it's important for items that we can't come to consensus on, but everybody but 1 or 2 or 60% of them are for it. We want to include it in the plan, but explain why we're including it and why there was folks that did not.
I would think you'd at least discuss it in your plan, even if you don't recommend it. That way, 10 years from now, when the next group gets together, they have something to look back on.
Yeah. That was what Saluda and so thought they wanted to at least memorialize that discussion. So my suggestion is we'll try to come to consensus. When we can't, at least during this meeting, we'll put it in the yellow bucket. We'll revisit it. If we still can't come to consensus, we'll say no point in debating this any longer. Let's do a vote, see how the vote pans out. There's a majority, we'll put it in the plan. We'll try to include a narrative to explain why people voted for it, why people did vote for it. Is everybody comfortable with that? Okay. The challenge is we've got a lot of policy, regulatory, legislative recommendations to get through, and each one of them could have half-hour of debate or more. And the other RBCs, we had the luxury of 4, 5, 6 meetings to tackle recommendations. In this RBC, we don't have that luxury. So when you're commenting on these, I ask that you try to keep your remarks concise and brief. I'm looking at you, Jason. But Jason has a lot of good stuff to add, but I don't want to cut anybody short. But just keep that in mind, because the more we talk about one item, that means there's 5 other items in the meetings that we can't get to. So that said, I don't want to shortchange anybody. Right, some stuff's important to you, right? Just it needs to be debated and discussed. We'll do that, but just remember that there's other items that are important to other people later on. The planning framework characterizes these categories of recommendations or recommendations that you all can make. Could be modifications to state law, local laws, regulations, or ordinances. So we've been talking about state law. If you want to make a recommendation about local ordinances, county ordinances, that's something you can do too. And some of the RBCs have suggested that, and we'll see some examples. You can make recommendations for new laws, new regulations, new ordinances. We're going to talk about ideas for recurring funding. Do you think there should be recurring funding for water planning work? Do you think there should be state level funding for implementation of the strategies and BMPs that you all suggest? So that's a topic we'll consider under this category. And then do you think there should be a restructuring of existing cruiser agencies? There was just a restructuring. DES. So I would expect that you have ideas, but maybe you do. If you think, oh, DES, it's a big conglomerate, it should be broken up in 5 groups. Anyway, those are all topics that we could cover under policy, legislative, and regulatory recommendations. Okay, so you've seen this table, you've seen what other RBCs have discussed and where there's been consensus, what they've agreed to. That's kind of the background going into this. Again, every basin is different, so there were some reasons why Basin felt it was a good idea, some reasons why Basin felt it wasn't a good idea. They didn't support it. All right, let's start with what's been an easy one, generally. And this is one that Joe highlighted in his agricultural case study. It's the concept of reasonable use. There's been a recommendation that's been supported by, I think, nearly all of the RBCs. Yep. About reasonable use. And it says the Water Withdrawal Permitting and Reporting Act should allow for reasonable use criteria to be applied to all surface water withdrawals, like those that currently exist for groundwater withdrawals. Because it doesn't allow for reasonable use, we've had these new registrations issued that have taken up the available safe yield of a particular portion of the basin, requiring ag to come in and request a permit. That wasn't the intent of this law, but that's what's happened in practice. The folks that have applied for these registrations have no intent to use that water. In fact, they've tied up enough water that they could irrigate half the Edisto Basin, or portions of the PD Basin. So it's not even realistic, but they saw the loophole there and realized that, hey, we can tie up water in this basin as kind of a management strategy on their own. So, do you all agree with this recommendation that reasonable use criteria should be able to be considered when applying for a surface water registration?
Yes.
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 Yes. Everybody shaking their head? Does anybody not understand this recommendation or have questions about it? Okay. I can put this one into a green bucket. Online folks, Alicia, John, and Brandon, please chime in. John's in favor, good. If you have issues with anything that we're talking about, if I hear silence from you online folks, I'm going to generally think you're in favor of something. Okay. That was easy. Green bucket. One down, 20 something to go. Each degrees, okay. All right. The next one is kind of an all-encompassing, very unspecific recommendation. And there's a reason why it's not specific. But it has to do with kind of the idea of grandfathering. And it says that there needs to be improvement to the current laws and to allow for regulation of water use so that they are enforceable and effective. Current water law, which grandfathers most water users, needs to be improved to support that management of state's water resources. The discussion around this has recognized that 97% of the water users are grandfathered. And they can pull out pretty much as much as that they're permitted, which was based generally on the size of their intake. In the discussions that, well, the state doesn't really have the ability to manage that. They've issued these permits out there, and we've run model scenarios for surface water. We've seen that many, all of the basins are what we could say over allocated, that there are shortages during drought periods. When you account for everybody withdrawing at their fully permitted or registered amount. That's not very realistic. That's not gonna happen anytime in the near future, maybe even ever. But it speaks to the fact that there's been more permits and registrations issued than what the basin support. So each RBC has talked about, well, how can we improve that? And there hasn't really been a lot of consensus. The broad RBC actually proposed this recommendation, which has been approved by subsequent meeting RBCs. That's just more of a big picture. It kind of puts the impetus on the legislature and the regulators to figure out what's a more effective solution.
The state law will have to change if we're gonna change this, because everything we're doing is based on the enabling legislation.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Yeah, some can be fixed by regulation, but others will need that statutory change.
Right. So they've kept it very general because no one has a good solution that's been able to reach consensus on. And it's just more of a recognition that we need to improve this since so many of our water withdrawals are grandfathered. It's not really an effective way to manage.
As a grandfathered withdrawer, I mean, we have been, in theory, amenable to the unifying of the criteria groups and subjecting all to some kind of unanimous criteria that makes sense. Our objection and concern is that if you open up the law to make one group of the three without any real recognition of an over allocated resource or agreement on how much of the resource is actually available, and an acknowledgement that it is a finite resource. And as you're going to continually hand out that resource at some point, everybody's going to feel the pinch of an over allocated resource. And so this is great in theory. And I think in theory, most would agree this is what needs to happen. But the fear is that you're going to just free up and hand out. And the only person they're going to really feel the pinch is everybody splitting an increasingly small portion of the limited resources during drought. That is a realistic fear of every withdrawer, but especially the biggest withdrawer, is that, that this slice of the pizza gets smaller and smaller. As the state says, yes, 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 to everybody, regardless of who they are. And it won't just affect their ability to withdraw, it'll affect MIF as the resource continues to get strained. So should it be up to those that have been around for 100 years to continually strain their resource more and more during drought, or some recognition that there's a finite amount of the resource to hand out? And what does the math support? We've got 8+ years of stream flow data. We've now got SWAM modeling. Hopefully we'll eventually have SWAM modeling for our basin. It shows that there will be shortages eventually. Some basins already.
But this is just saying that we are agreeing to that something needs to change. That's how I'm reading it at least.
I agree, something needs to change.
I think if we didn't all unanimously agree with this, then why are we?
Then why are we here?
Right,
Yeah,
and 97% of people with just doing whatever.
Why are we
right?
here? So my bigger question to you, John, is how in the heck did you have an Edisto basin that didn't discuss this?
I was gonna ask the same thing. Did you just
But
not?
why are we here? If we're not,
That's
we don't
not
make that
first, right? And this really didn't get recommended as, it wasn't discussed as a recommendation. It was the broad, which was second, where somebody said, you know what, we've got this grandfathered issue. I'm not sure how to solve it, but let's do a recommendation that at least acknowledges the issue. Says somebody needs to solve this. That just never came up in discussion in the Edisto.
So as an Edisto RBC member currently on
Yes.
RBC, let me filed RBC.
There's still time to talk about it. There's still
These,
time to
I'm
talk
talking about it now. These concepts were in theory brought up and discussed, just not this exact verbiage that's up there right now. But just like we talked about the green, yellow, and red buckets, it was the unrealistic criteria buckets that the green is unanimity. And then the yellow was supermajority. And the reality is, on a lot of things like this, in concept, though not verbally worded just like this, we have supermajority agreement on a lot of these things. It only took one dissenting voice out of the 30 or so members to be like, oh, it's not a green bucket.
Right, I'll have a bigger one.
is that realistic in any regulatory advisory or legal counsel that you, like, unanimity? Can we 100% agree on anything in this life?
This language is pretty soft. It just says enforceable and effective.
And I think if this language was broad, I would like to think that the one or two dissenting on every single thing we brought up, voices would agree to it, but you have to react.
Y'all should have reanalyzed your group.
We only have so much. Right. And they, most of it would probably say I was the one that needed to come off, so let's not go through that.
I voted for green on this one.
Also, it says it wasn't discussed. I'm teaching
No, it
you,
was.
right? But it said, well, this is white for your edisto. So
It was
it's
not
discussed.
even brought up, like this exact.
This language is not
I
discussed,
see.
but the concepts behind it were kind of discussed.
Gotcha.
It never goes around.
Look, our disadvantage is that we don't have as much time. Our advantage is we get to learn from
Yes.
the mistakes of others.
Yes,
Yeah, okay. So
learn about it.
Mike's good with it. Anybody have problems with this recommendation? I mean, it's not the greatest recommendation, but it does recognize there's an issue and everybody else is with it. I think it's important. If you're behind it, we'll include it. John, I mean, to your point about having a vote, we can always have a vote if we need to. Right, sounds like everyone's in favor. We're gonna throw that one in the green bucket. Go to the next one.
I mean, since you're saying green is unanimity,
Well, yeah, I'm not necessarily saying, well, in this case, I am saying green is unanimity. We may get to one where we have a lot of debate, and I'm saying we're gonna put it in a yellow bucket. We're gonna revisit that at another meeting.
for the sake of getting buy-in at the eventual plan voting, I back the plan, not back the plan, and given following the rules of order, I'm just saying it might be good to say, is there anybody that disagrees with this? Because that would disqualify the green bucket. We're giving everybody on the record a chance to either agree it's a green bucket or say, no, it's not a green bucket. It only takes one.
Right. Yeah.
That's why every single thing we did as an edisto had to come to official vote.
For the sake of time, I'm not gonna go around and do official vote with everybody. If I hear somebody that's opposed to it, talk about it. We can't get consensus, just 100%. Put it in the yellow bucket, or we may just throw it out, or we may do a vote.
We should have done that edisto.
We've refined our approach. Okay, next one. This one has to do with funding. It says the South Carolina legislature should authorize recurring funding for state water planning activities, including river basin planning. Currently, nearly all the funding for river basin planning processes come from the legislature. So this, I think this one was actually talked about with the EDSO either.
It was.
Was it?
Certain voices didn't think the current river basin council process should have been funded.
That's true. I do remember that. Yeah.
Like I said, you need to reanalyze your group.
Well, not everybody's.
Yeah, they're like,
everybody's in favor of planning and spending money on it. So it's open for debate. What do you all think? Do you think water planning is important and should be continued, or is this round of planning enough? And we could revisit it at the next update of the state water plan in 10 years, 20 years, or what are your thoughts?
Continual funding.
I think it should be funded.
Continual funding?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because our population's continuing to grow. And we've got to be able to work toward resolution on a continuing basis, not just, hey, let's look at it 10 years.
Once there's a problem, right?
Exactly. Exactly. I think unfortunately we get put in a box as check the box for stakeholders. Oh, we had a stakeholder meeting, check the box. And I think that needs to change. But I think that's going to take time and continual funding for that.
And understanding on the behalf of the legislators. You need somebody up there with some passion for this,
Right.
to push it on the House side and the Senate side.
Yeah.
Okay. Alicia had a question. And have a comment. Should the language be stronger, more specific? I kind of call that a question. It's more of a suggestion in the frame of question. Do you all think that this needs to be more specific? Like there needs to be recurring funding so that river basin councils can meet at a minimum quarterly, or I'm just making stuff up, or do you want to add a number to it, or I don't know, Alicia, you had any specific ideas in mind to make it more specific?
I didn't have anything in mind, but it just seemed kind of generic, so I just wanted to pose it to the group in case they had any kind of recommendations for something they would want to see, or if they wanted it to be stronger.
The question is what, all right, we get this done, we finish up. Then how does this go to the legislature? Is this something that a presentation to a committee in the House, a committee in the Senate's made and it goes away? What happens?
With your specific river basin plan?
Yeah.
I don't know that any specific legislators look at it and read it. I hope some of them do, especially ones that represent this area. What we want to happen out of it is our implementation plan, which is going to be chapter 10. We want funding and we want support from participating agencies to help implement those actions and strategies in our implementation plan. That might require money from the state or money from cooperative partners or whatever. It's what we put in our implementation plan. It's what's going to happen. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess it's just.
Well, John, some of this will get documented in the state water plan, but you hopefully will have some way be presented to the legislature.
Yeah, that's another part of it is we want to compile all these recommendations from the RBCs, consider them in the state plan, and that's where legislatures are more likely to look and say, okay, where has there been consensus on recommendations about policy or additional monitoring, whatever it might be.
Well, and that being said, like, I mean, that could be a role of people within this group to be able to talk with our, our legislators, the ones that represent this area, and say we were able to build consensus on these things, and this is an important thing for the Santee River Basin.
The lady, the state climatologist who came and talked to us, I was really surprised at the lack of weather stations across the state. I thought that there would be 3 or 4 in every county. And, things like that need to be funded.
Things like that is what SCORE and their resilience plan, they recommend so much more monitoring and so much more data to be able to support these kind of decisions.
Anybody have any ideas for making this more specific? Sounds like everyone's generally for it.
I just wonder, they're never going to approve a blank check. And in their mind, continually funding at the current levels that were approved for this process. I mean, we're not necessarily rerunning the SWAN models constantly or, John's team has been administering every monthly meeting in more than once a month meetings. I guess the point is the ongoing funding may not need to be anywhere near what the current funding is. At a minimum, though, at some frequency, the river basin continues to meet to keep some continuity within plan revision, consideration, and to continue to be engaged in the state water planning cycles.
John, have you developed a budget? If this thing were to continue, I mean, CDM Smith's been retained by the state to do this, to oversee these studies. Did you put a budget together for consideration?
Not beyond the current phase of planning.
Or does what you're saying, for DES, like the CES, what would y'all need in order to continue this process at a reasonable level?
Maintenance level planning.
I mean, Georgia's a good example. They did their original plans 10 or 12 years ago, and then they've done 2 updates to their plans. So their regional councils continue to meet the funding requirements after you've done your original plan or lower. They don't meet as frequently. They meet sometimes 4 times a year, sometimes more, sometimes less. It depends on what's going on.
It also depends upon the scope you're expanding.
Right.
If you're just reviewing water quantity again, yeah, it should be less cost if I get a good handle on it. But to do an update to a river basin plan, and just look at quantity. If you start talking about quality or other considerations, it's a little bit unknown there.
Require new models to be built and developed and run and additional detail.
Well, start with a budget. Start with a, April, we're still, we can write anything on it we want to and come up with a reasonable budget to continue to pursue this instead of just drop it, pick it back up in 10 years.
Well, then with something, if we were to amend this language, the South Carolina legislature authorizes recurring funding as requested by the Department of Environmental Services for state water planning, because I'm basically looking to, to y'all to say how much is needed to continue this process based on the demand
Still.
and the annual, in the annual budget request.
Yes, so we do, so our recommendations that we develop, a lot of them then go into our implementation plan. So how do we get these recommendations working or going in practice? Not all of them do, like some of the legislative regulatory ones, that's up to DES and the legislature to do. But a lot of our recommendations will be stuff that we can do, we can work with other agencies to do. In the implementation plan, we put these action and strategies to implement these recommendations, and we often assign a budget to it. Say, this were to be done, it might be $50,000 per year for 4 meetings or something. So we can add that in there. It won't be in this recommendation.
Understood, but at the end of the day, there needs to be a recommendation that goes to the legislature that continually funds this process.
Okay.
And by including that language, it wouldn't be like a blank check, because during DES, during their annual budget request, that has, it goes through the committee process, it goes through multiple levels of review. They have to say, we want X amount for this reason. And it's basically just saying that we would support it if DES were to request it.
At the end of the day, legislative buy-in has been critical to making any actual changes. So, I think it's an extent that such an inclusion in our plan would encourage legislative involvement. That might actually be helpful. Because it forces them to look at what we're doing and take seriously the recommendations we're making. So this stays on the forefront of issues in their mind. It doesn't just get stuck on the shelf somewhere. Because like I said, my concern at the end of the day with this whole process, we can't spend this whole year working on something that.
Right, that they're never gonna read.
Yeah.
But different legislators have different passions. You've got some up there that are passionate about DOT. You've got some up there that are, passionate about healthcare or schools. Greg Embry, for example, so we need to find those House and Senate members that are passionate about this and let them carry the ball.
And I mean, it's also hard because there's so many new legislators. This is something that we've been talking about in the conservation community for over a decade. And now we have almost all new legislators. It's in the Senate and the House, there's been so much turnover that I don't think a lot of legislators actually know how big of an issue this is. And that's why there has been this kind of compounded, analysis of having this process go on with Water SC with the Surface Water Subcommittee. So I think education is a huge portion of it as well.
Any more discussion on this, or do you want to put it into a green bucket?
Do we want to amend it to say as requested by DES? I would feel comfortable with that, just to put it in their court of saying what they need.
Feel like it needs to be minimum yearly when we get together. I mean, it may only be once a year, Ken, but because I go back to what Michael said, we're gonna be a checkbox right now. And they're gonna get the state water plan done, and it's gonna get polished, and it's gonna get put on a shelf, just like the last water plan.
So should it be to maintain yearly,
I feel like it needs to
yearly
be language,
something?
yeah,
Or-
annual plan.
How do we say, we want $1 million to read the plan?
Well, and didn't we all get elected to
$5 million.
serve a term anyway?
Yeah.
We're not gonna have any
Three,
more
I'm
meetings.
in for 3.
I think I'm in two. So
If we don't have a plan review, it's a good foundation
Take it rid
for
of-
comment. And then as we have implementation, we can request additional funds, but base funding for periodic review of the plan at a minimum, keep the RDCs alive.
My proposed language would be at a minimum annual review or as requested by DES or DNR. I mean, I think we need to meet annually whether they ask for it or not,
Getting in the weeds.
so that's the minimum. And then as requested.
I'm just putting notes for practical.
Yeah.
Hey, John,
Yeah,
can we break for lunch after this?
we can.
Okay.
You getting hungry down there, bro?
No, I know, we're getting cranky. We're getting in the weeds and we're getting cranky. It's time to eat. There's been a request and I was voicing, thank you, Roy. Welcome. I'm at the head of the table. I'm just.
You are at the head of it.
I'm telling you, excuse me. Mom's at the head of council.
All right, so we're gonna put this in the green bucket.
Yeah.
Again, if you review a draft of chapter 9, you get to look at the language that supports these recommendations. And if you have additional details you want to and you can add them into it. Right now, we just want to capture your thoughts and get it on paper. If I'm there's consensus. So I think we have consensus on this one. We'll put it in the green bucket. Let's break for lunch. And we'll go to- we can bring it back. Let me bring it back here. Where
I just don't understand.
basically out the door to the right.
Are you watching the doors?
Okay.
Right.
Try to get come back.
Well, that's interesting. I thought about carrying it just in case you get a flat tire up there. You know, put a collar. It is well done.
Okay. All right, another common recommendation that had to do with funding, is what we're showing now, says the legislature should establish a grant program to help support the implementation of the actions and strategies identified in each river basin plan. In a couple of the RBCs, actually maybe at least one, we heard from Georgia because they have a good example for how this works in practice. They developed a seed grant program. They've been doing water planning for a lot longer, and their regional water plans have actions and strategies that can sometimes be supported by the seed grant program. There's not a lot of money in the seed grant programs, but there's enough money there to get some of these actions and strategies implemented. And an example might be for a utility or a municipality to come up with like a contingency water supply or something. The seed grant might start the funding of initial planning for that. So maybe pay for like 30% design or something. It's not a lot. But the point of it is to provide some type of funding so that these river basin plan actions and strategies can begin to be implemented. Other states, there's much more serious water issue. Like Colorado and Texas have their own funding programs. Like in Colorado, if they take a portion of gambling funds to support water projects.
Oh,
Texas, what they do, they have some type of
Casino
water
man.
funding. It's a designated revenue stream. Those are, less water states.
Supporting education for water. We put educational loans, bad numbers.
So that's just an example. The reason we put this in here is because other RBCs have said, yeah, that's important. We need a recommendation not just to develop, to do the planning, but to actually implement some of the stuff that we propose. What are your thoughts? Support that?
I like it. I think it makes sense. I also wonder if there should be some mention of like local municipalities and having, maybe it's not a program, but them prioritizing, potentially funding some projects for implementation. So also putting it kind of, spreading it out so it's not all in the state to fund, but also local municipalities have some kind of stake in the game too.
Others think. Think it's a needed recommendation or? We don't have it?
I like the idea of kind of breaking out the previous recommendation to continue to fund the River Basin Council to meet on some periodicity. But it would be talked about implementation under that recommendation, but this is kind of a second recommendation for funding implementation.
Yeah.
And the details of a grant funding program can be worked out, whether there's a price match or whatever. I don't think we should narrow it down to the utilities because, as Alan's pointed out, there should be other stakeholders implementing things too. I don't want it to be a utility grant program. It should be an implementation grant program for the River Basin Councils for whichever stakeholder wants to be able to utilize those grant funds for implementation.
Also, when you have a grant, you have to have a plan. You have to, you have to have parameters in order to earn the grant. So it makes sense. It's not just like throwing money at something. There's got to be like a game plan. That to me seems like a good idea.
In Georgia case, they actually have to apply for it.
Absolutely.
Not everybody gets approved. It's a very modest program, at least the Georgia one. It doesn't really fund huge projects. It's like $150,000 projects to get the thing started, basically.
That's when you talk about like an analogous funding mechanism grant, like 319 grants for non-point source, you got your watershed-based plan development and then implementation. A lot of times those might be anywhere between a 50 and a couple 100,000, but they are critical to actually getting some of those implementation BMPs done. And so having a mechanism like that within the River Basin household framework, I think would be helpful.
I don't know if this is opening enough can of worms, but I've seen in the last month or so, at the federal level, suggestions that SRF and the Clean Water Program should be, I don't want to say defunded, but.
They just cut it 89%.
Sorry?
SRF was just cut 89%.
Yeah, basically putting the impetus on the states to come up with their own money rather than federal money that's passed down to the states. And that's for, all types of infrastructure projects, and it's a lot of money. And I think the Trump administration is saying, well, that's kind of redundant with like the WIFIA program, which I don't agree, because WIFIA is for large scale projects, and it's very cumbersome to apply for. But there may be a change in how states pass down, be passed down, help fund water projects and wastewater projects, and that may overshadow any type of project. Well, there's overlap here with what we're talking about. Some of the recommended strategies and actions and projects that come out of our plan potentially be stuff that could be funded by SRF and Clean Water, more so SRF in this case. But I just mentioned that because I think you need to be thinking about that. There may be a bigger issue than just implementing projects that are recommended in our plan. There may be an issue with implementing projects that we normally would have SRF on.
Those SRF funded watershed-based plans, 319 NPS program, didn't it, under DES?
Funded the NPDES
The
program?
NPS, the non-point source
I believe
319
so,
program.
yes, yeah, the non-point program.
So for the development and implementation of those, that be a major impact to the budget.
For that out there, I don't know how it impacts any recommendation you all would make.
It's not good news.
Okay, well, I'll generally agree with this recommendation. Do you want to alter it? Anybody opposed to it?
Because I heard to ask.
Not opposed?
If you don't ask, the answer is always no.
Yeah. Yeah. Leave it, move on?
Agreed.
Great, okay. Right. Okay, this one gets into, I think, the concept that Riley, you mentioned earlier about registrations and permits. I think you were suggesting there shouldn't be both registrations and permits. There should just be one permit for everything. That what you were suggesting.
Yep.
And this has been debated in other RBCs, and there hasn't been as much consensus on this one as there has the previous recommendations that we've talked about. But the recommendation I've written, which was improved, yeah, only the broad and a majority of the Edisto, and it was a very slight majority, if I recall, approved this one. Said water law and intermittent regulations should not distinguish between registrations and permits. Or above that 3 million gallon per month threshold, you should just have to apply for a permit.
The people who did not agree, what was their issue?
Allocation.
Well, this is not written the way I heard you phrase it. This says you should just register. You do not apply for a permit, right? Or am I reading this wrong?
There was a distinction between registration and permitting, and it has to be used areas.
If you don't apply for a permit, you just register.
Well, no, it says currently law allows for ag users and all groundwater users outside of gas use areas to register their water then.
Oh, and this is saying all water users.
Yeah, and this is saying.
Oh, okay, so it should be required to
Should be
apply.
required, yeah.
Well, permit, I got you.
Sorry, John said, is there, that's the distinction between registration and permit and capacity use areas. Correct. And you can speak to that.
Yeah, so a registration for surface water is just those ag or aquaculture users, that they still have to meet that safe yield number when getting their registration. for groundwater, it's any groundwater user that is withdrawing 3 million or more outside of capacity use areas that they would need to register for. But that, and it's not, they're really just, they're not even going through any real process beyond just letting us know, hey, we're just registering with the department, like letting you know that we're here and we're withdrawing for our use. Versus on the service source side, they actually have kind of a volume attached to their registration.
Or the pushback against it, as mentioned by other council members, other RBCs, is that, well, one, if it's a permit and the same fee is applied, that's difficult for certain users, small farmers to do. And that's the one. Second one is that they don't want to have to abide by administering flows, because when there's a drought, they're all surface water. That's when they really need water to maintain their crops. And they have to water it. You can't say, oh, I got to cut back because I don't want to go below the administering flow. That's another common reason against it.
And I feel like, excuse me, all that can be worked out. You know, the devil's going to be in the details here. And obviously we do need to prioritize water for our farmers. We all need that water to go to them to be able to, you know, like feed our country. No one's arguing that point. It's just bringing everyone under the same umbrella, to be able to more fully kind of evaluate our water resources in an effective way. But I think that all that can be worked out.
If it's not permitted, you can't manage it.
Yeah.
There's no way to manage.
Is there any other like, permit, well, registration, like for like DES kind of like this? Like, is there any other program that has registrations where they're using a resource to this extent, but not actually permitted?
Nothing's coming to mind.
Yeah.
Structure your grant program to cover costs for those small users where registration and fees.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity to just require everybody to do a permit. You can still differentiate between ag and other users so that there's no cost of the service on small users or ag users. You apply for the permit, so it's gonna be a different fee structure, but you still expanding some of the conditions that everybody maintains, something like
Yeah,
that.
because some other states have fee structure based on how much water your permit is for. So it could even be something like that, that is a recommendation.
That's the way most of our DHEC fees are structured. It's based on how many taps I have. Based on that.
And
Just, again, making sure I understand this, really the only difference between a new registration and a new permit is the MIF component. Everybody has to comply with the safety yield. But the only additional burden to go to a permit would be the MIF requirement.
and the fees.
And the fees.
Yeah.
But we can figure the fees out.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
fees doesn't seem like it shouldn't be a barrier. But you'll actually be making more money. The agency would if you had everybody permitted. Obviously, that's more people paying the fee, and then you can structure it so
And you
that
can structure the fees down so that they're affordable.
Put it in context of why the broad RBC improvement is, there's very little agriculture up in the broad. They didn't really have a voice of the council at the time this recommendation was considered. There wasn't ag in the room necessarily to say, yeah, we're not good people, we're not good for this. So I'm not sure I'd call it a consensus-based recommendation in terms of representation from the entire 8 different interest categories.
Kind of going back to the pizza analogy that you keep using where all the pieces get smaller. If you put everyone under the same process and everyone's based off of minimum midstream flow, which is fine, but then everyone's getting a smaller piece, that also limits ag, industry, water utilities as to what they can actually pull. So you open that up and you leave it up to the legislature's interpretation. That's risky.
Best interest. With you.
So that'd be my concern. Like, you know, if I can currently irrigate 2,000 acres of my 5,000 acres, and I'm permitted to be able to irrigate the full 5,000, if we switch to this and then all of a sudden I can't irrigate 1,000 acres, well, I've lost production and now I'm losing income on my farm.
Why would you not be able to irrigate at the same level? I guess
But kind of going to that pizza analogy, if we're splitting everything up and I was permitted to use let's just say 30 million gallons. And now we split it up and I only got permitted to use 10. That's gonna hurt.
But why would you be permitted to only use 10? Like, you know, if we go back to like kind of like the reasonable use, like, you know, like criteria. And I also think that, you know, there could be by transferring things to permits to keep, you know, farmers and agricultural registrants at the same level that they were. Like, I think that if we transfer to a permit, then they should keep that same amount. And then just like moving to every 10 years, evaluate for like reasonable use. So I think they should be able to keep that exact same amount if we go from, you know, registrations to permits to prevent that from happening.
But that's where I'm just mentioning, just to add a note of, if you leave it up to the interpretation of legislators, they may not interpret it that way. No matter if it's written up in this plan by every RBC in their plan that it should be split the way you're explaining it, they may completely decide otherwise.
I mean, they can do that anyways, you know, with anything that we're putting forward. And I think that's also why if we do work some of those things out, you know, a role of people within this council is to be able to go and tell legislatures, like, we all agree on this, and this is like our perspective from ag and from conservation, because something that, you know, I always see is they want people to build consensus. They want people to come to the table just like this and to figure things out. It makes their life a lot easier. And so like, if we're able to work some of these things out, I hear you, like they can ultimately do what they want, but I think there's a lot of new legislators, a lot of people don't know about this, and they want to hear from the stakeholders that are impacted by it.
I think my standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint, and I understand what you're saying, I think there's a fear of the unknown. And I get that, same with Jason, it's just a fear of what could happen. But if I step back and say, why are we here? It's to manage the state's resources better in the future. So we're talking year 2050, not tomorrow. I think you need one set of guiding principles and laws, and right now we have multiple, and it's confusing. It, you know, to me, it's similar to, you know, we have one speed limit on the road, and we all go the same. 18-wheelers don't get to drive with a different set of rules. So now there are different requirements for an 18-wheeler driver, and agriculture may have different requirements for that, but to me, you would have one set of rules, whether we call it registration or permits or whatever words you want to use. And in that framework, you put in those protective guardrails that keep ag safe, that water utilities are safe and industry safe. But it's all the same system instead of multiple systems. Just my opinion.
And all three of you have very valid points, but the crux is, at the end of the day, it won't be based off theory, it'll be based off of actual impacts. And so when you bring up the pizza and the allocation issue and the eventual over allocation issue and the waning resource, even if they kept your registration amount in a permit as the same 30 MGD, but then there's only 10 MGD available because they've continued to hand out new permits, then you're at the receiving end of less resource at the end of the day. And so that in theory, yes, everybody needs to be under a permit, not permits, registrations, not different kinds of permits. But the two of you together made the argument for existing permits. You said you should get permits, but at current volumes and protected from new users. It's called an existing permit or a grandfathered permit. That was the whole reason for the argument of grandfathered permits versus new, that you're protected against new permits. And so even if I think you could go to one group, not three, as long as you solve based off sound math, say yield and MIF and what happens at MIF. But if you're not going to do that, then you've got to have a minimum of two, protected, grandfathered, and new. New makes the brunt of an over allocated resource.
Yeah, but if the protected and grandfathered are way beyond what is needed, even in a rough year, then the whole system needs to be looked at.
But what if they're not?
Well, that's why evaluating for reasonable use every 10 years.
Again, system needs to be looked at. You need to determine what's valid amount and a reasonable amount of use.
Well, I think we all agreed on reasonable use. And I would argue 20-ish years on permits, 20 to 30 based off of bond cycle funding. You know, you can't fund a multi-$100 million capital project in a 5-year rate increase. But trust me, it won't work. We're not taxpayer supported. And so as long as the term of the permits and everybody's under these permits is reasonable, And as long as the allocation is based off of sound math, and as long as when MIF is reached, we can agree on what the MIF is and what happens at MIF. This is, everybody would agree to this, but the devil's gonna be in the details.
Yeah.
To be truly protective of the withdrawers and truly protective of the resource. But sound math is in the benefit of all of us.
If you, again, going back to I'm using the comments, the devil's in the details. It was missed back, the Water Use Act, to make sure that ag could transfer to another ag user. So,
Could be another possible change to bring up.
Yeah.
Not a bad one.
having some comments, yeah.
Unfortunately, Vicky's not here today. Is our sole ag representative?
Well, I am in a way, but not with the knowledge that he had. I think whenever, to Jason's point, whenever you toss something up and then legislators, it goes up here, legislation. I think that's the risk. I think we're concerned about that. Lawmakers, what are they in the mood for? What lobby's giving them money?
I mean, that's why they're looking at, that's why we have this whole process. It's like and that's why they have Water SC. They want to hear from the stakeholders, and that's why we're going through the process.
Legislators took DNR recommendations to expand the turkey season back and reduce the counts, and they did two completely different things out of wood. They made it where you couldn't kill jakes, and they also reduced, they switched up the dates, like they didn't even hit the dates DNR wanted. So that was scientific DNR biologist information they took. And said,
I was
nah,
at the meeting, I was at the meeting with Charles Roux. Yeah, at least they shortened the season. I think that helped.
Well, and not shooting jacks too. I think that was a big.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, they can do whatever they want. It's like, do we want to be part of the conversation or not?
So I think we all agree we don't want a change that's worse than what we currently have. That doesn't mean we can't acknowledge that the problem is what we currently
Well,
have.
again, somebody, when this ends up for the House and the Senate, there's got to be a champion. There's got to be somebody with some passion about this to push it through the right way. If not, it will get passed. And if you got somebody with some tenure up there, then it can get passed the way you want it. But that's the secret to anything having to do with the legislature.
Bipartisan legislation.
Would it make everyone more comfortable if we clarified more about, so registrations and permits? If we made them all permits, how would that change? Not reduce, how can we prevent it from reducing certain protections? But not have these forever permits that roll along. Would you be in favor of no more forever permits?
I'm not against the folks that are grandfathered, making sure that they're actually using what they say.
Right, and following certain rules and whatever.
I'm not against that. I do think you need a reasonable time period, you know, a 10, 20-year time period is probably reasonable because, I mean, within ag, you're going to make commodity decisions, how many acres you're going to put.
For sure, what you're farming, cotton, soybeans, whatever it is.
Based off of the commodity price of that previous year, and that's going to be a yearly decision.
Yeah.
So, and then all of a sudden, you might decide to pick up fruit and vegetable production, but fruit and vegetable production is also going to require more water.
Indeed, it's early peaches at the beginning, like when you
Right.
first plant your,
Right.
the early, like with the golf course.
Yeah.
When lip trees need more water than older trees, for sure.
Yes.
There's just a lot of moving parts in that.
Right.
That legislators might have a hard time understanding.
I feel.
I understand what you're. So.
John had a comment on this. The seed station have more say in permit transfer than the permittee. That's kind of a different issue together. Okay. I'm having a hard time following whether you all are in favor of.
I think that needs to go in a yellow, green, but between the green and the yellow, like a chartreuse bucket.
I don't know what color that is.
Chartreuse is a green, yellow color that's like,
Just
looks
because,
like seaweed.
just for the fact that Vicky's not here, and I hate to have this, because this is.
Yeah, that's
very
not
important to ag.
Why don't we table it till next meeting?
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna suggest. Sam does a great job of filling in and giving an ag voice, but of course, Sam's not on the RBC, but I still value his opinion.
Right.
I can add comments, I just.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, but I say, just for the sake of moving on, let's yellow bucket this and hopefully we can get Vicky at the next meeting, we'll revisit it.
The new
See if it
bucket,
kind of
chartreuse.
Let's try to do one more before we have to wrap it up. This one. This is kind of an interesting one. Kind of took on a different flavor depending on which RBC, but there's discussion in the broad RBC that maybe the permitting and registration, maybe the permitting process should assess the permit applicant's alignment with the current river basin plan. They say, what does that mean? What does alignment with the river basin plan mean? That's a little bit open to criteria or subjectiveness, I guess. I'm not sure how to exactly answer that. Or another RBC said, well, maybe the water withdrawal permitting process should assess the permit applicant's alignment with the legislatively approved state water plan. So not just the state water plan, but assuming that it gets approved by the legislature, then when Leanne is making permit decisions, she needs to follow the regulation as it is, but also reference the state plan or the river basin plans and make sure that there's nothing that's not in alignment. Which again, I'm not sure what.
There will never be another permit or registration given if you have to align the law, the regulation, and basin plan.
But that's been.
The regulators are the regulators, the basin plans are recommendations. They're good recommendations. They all fit the state water plan, but.
It's not saying that if you don't do every single one of these things, you don't get your permit. I think it's just like kind of like a comprehensive plan with like, like local government to see, it's like, is it following in the direction of the plan that we all set forth, so it's not, I don't think that it would have an ultimate like deciding factor whether or not a permit gets issued or not, but just saying like, okay, this does align in the direction that we are trying to go for our plan. And so maybe make recommendations on potential best management practices. So to me, I view it as like a tool for DES to make recommendations for the permittees or the applicants on it, not as a deciding factor of like you do or you don't get your permit.
But it is that now, isn't it? I mean, the River Basin Council plans are recommendations. And if you make it anywhere verbally prescriptive or permitting process around it, we will lose the ability to develop any consensus on the River Basin councils.
It's just putting it within like the review process of DES to be able to consider. I think to me, that's how I read it.
That's kind of flawed, but again, I feel like there's a lot of subjectivity to it. It could be challenged easily if someone is denied permit because it wasn't in alignment with the state water plan or the river basin plan. I don't know, that may just open up a can of worms. And why is it not in alignment? I don't know, maybe you can do that. Maybe you can point to specific items or recommendations or strategies or actions in either plan that the permit would not be consistent with. I'm just hard pressed to think of specific examples though where that would apply.
I would think they should be aligned with the state water plan. River basin plans are too specific, so that probably doesn't make sense to me because there's different RBCs. But why would they not be aligned with the state water plan?
But the state water plan is going to defer to the law and the regulation and potentially recommendations within the River Basin Council that is accomplishing this.
Yeah.
But the idea that the River Basin Councils would have any ability or authority to dissent against a permit or registration, if you want that to be at the whim of the current makeup of the current RBC in a given basin.
I don't read it as that strong of a statement. I just read it as that there should be alignment between all these documents. Not that this is a guiding principle, but just that in general, you want them to agree. That's just
I think wanting them to agree, but then making decisions on whether you issue a permit or not are different questions.
Yeah, I agree.
Very much so, yeah.
It would have to get implemented into a statute or regulation for it to have that type of bearing where, give bring concerns. I mean, I think just simply making a recommendation that they align is probably reasonable, but you still permit per the regulation.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is just like any number of permitting processes. I'm thinking of surface water discharge permits, or where you you need a letter from the Corps of Engineers, for instance, will get an advisory letter from the National Marine Fisheries Service or from DNR, or from State Historic Preservation Office. And, they just provide an advisory opinion, which isn't which the permitting agency takes under advisement. So that's kind of how I was reading this recommendation.
That's a reasonable interpretation. What do y'all think? Is there one or other, you like any of these recommendations? Do alignment with river basin plan or alignment with state water plan, or do you have problems with both?
It seems like everybody's interpreting it differently. So maybe the language is not specific enough to.
There's
make
the
any
word
difference.
accept.
Right, that's a good point.
Yeah,
We can't, none of us understand it the same way. Maybe it's not good.
Like, it's maybe not worth, maybe it needs to be rewritten. There are new ones suggested.
So we table this and we can think about it and maybe.
Yeah, but if anybody has any ideas, unfortunately, I'm at a loss to provide specifics about what actual things you need to be in alignment with.
Well, the Broad and the Salkehatchie unanimously supported that they have some reasoning. Like they're green and the others are all white. So they did discuss the exact same thing.
Yeah, so when it was proposed in the Broad, I feel like Jet Lineberger from Duke Energy posted, I think he gave an example, and I feel like it was to do with like coastal management plans or something that I'm not familiar with, but he said it was a good example where there's a plan in place, and then permitting and regulation decisions have to be made consistent with that plan. No specifics about it. It just says, you can't do something that's inconsistent with what's in this plan.
What he's talking about there, the 8 coastal counties fall under coastal zone management plan. And I can do something in Florence County easily that I cannot do in Oree or Charleston or Berkeley. So that, I think that was his point, that different statutes, and I'm opposed to coastal zone consistency. I think the whole state should be treated the same way, because the water quality that ends up on the coast, they're so worried about, comes from Piedmont. It doesn't come from the coast. It's a whole different story. But I think that's what the guy from Duke concerned about. You develop a set of criteria, and then you get to the coast. And in North Carolina is the same way. You've got CAMA up there. You've got a whole different set of criteria for approvals.
Yes, so they're aligned, but I'm saying they kind of like the second one where there'd be alignment with the state water plan. I think in the lower Spansac, actually, we did not honestly debate it too much. We didn't get into the weeds. It was kind of like, yeah, that's a good idea. There certainly should be consistency with permitting decisions and what's in the state water plan, and they left it at that. So they didn't really over analyze it. They thought it was a good idea. At the same point, there's interpretation that may be important to work out. So,
I mean, I have enough problems with the law and the regulation. How crazy we add complexity of a whole nother document that is non-regulatory. When you're looking at permits, registration.
Every time you pass a law, there are unintended consequences.
I think too, that there are other recommendations we're gonna make that are probably more important, and to just dump a bunch of them in here for the sake of including them is gonna dilute the importance of those we really want to convey.
This is like if you can't murder innocent bystanders in Charleston County, you shouldn't be able to murder them in Berkeley County, but is that really necessary to say? Right? I mean, that's kind of like what we're saying.
Okay.
That's agreed, right?
All right. Well, let's do this. About we put it with like yellow away and red bucket. We can revisit it if
By the
somebody.
time she said murder, we gotta go.
And that's after I.
And she's been fed.
Time permitting, we may revisit it, but it doesn't sound like we're gonna necessarily have consensus, so we may not spend a lot of time on it in the future. All right, we're almost at time. We do have a lot more recommendations to consider. I want to give you an update on where things stand with models. And then we'll decide how to move forward, when to begin, and what we're going to tackle. been delayed because we're waiting on outflows from the Catawba Basin. I think we talked about this before. Another consultant working with the Catawba Water Management District has been updating their Catawba Basin model. In fact, they're kind of combining two different models to generate flows in the Catawba Basin. And we can't finish our CNT model update and then run these planning scenarios until we get outflows from the Catawba Basin. So they sent us an initial set, and we looked at them and realized there were some issues with them. And then we had actually a call with ES, Scott and Joe and others with Catawba Water Management Group Chair and Vice Chair. And they said they're reviewing their model, and they're actually meeting today, right now, to kind of do some QA/QC on it and try to figure out why the current version of the two models that they combined together are producing lower flows, especially during drought times, than the previous version of the model. So they want to get to the bottom of that. Long story short, they're not necessarily comfortable yet with how the model is simulating flow conditions. They asked the question, well, they understood that we need to move forward, and they said, do you want an interim set with the understanding that it might change? And I was not in favor of doing modeling with an interim set, because I don't want to have to go back and redo it. So I said, not really. So we'll know more information out of this meeting today. Some of our modelers are listening in on the meeting to get a better idea of what the issues are and where they stand. Point being that I doubt, well, we're not going to be, I don't think we're going to be getting flows from them within the next month or so. Maybe we will a month from now, but then it's going to take us another month or two to finish updating the model and run the planning scenarios. So realistically, we're probably looking at August or September before we could come back to you all with modeling for the Santee Basin. But that's up to make any decisions on what we do, or ask you to make any decisions on how we move forward until we hear from the results of this meeting today. So that's kind of where we stand. My suggestion is for the next meeting is let's continue our discussion of recommendations. There's still a lot of recommendations that we need to tackle. Next meeting is June. Just date for the next meeting. Yeah, we're starting to get into vacation season too. June 10th is everybody generally available on June 10th.
I'm on Thursday.
Is that a Tuesday? Sure.
Yay.
Okay, we'll plan on meeting again in June. We'll continue discussion on recommendations. If we get through this category of recommendations, we may start talking about planning process recommendations, which usually it's a shorter discussion. It's just you have recommendations on how we do river basin planning or state water planning. So that one shouldn't take that long. The other category of recommendations has to deal more with technical and program things. I'd rather not have that discussion until after we've done the modeling and you talked about water management strategies. Figured out where there's gaps and where there's more monitoring that may be needed, that type of thing. So I don't want to put the cart before the horse for that type of, those categories of recommendation. But we have enough to talk about. We can continue to meet in June. We may pause for July if we don't have, probably won't, any surface water results to discuss. But pausing in July might not be a bad thing because first or second week of July is usually a pretty heavy vacation time. May skip July, meet again in August, and we may have to meet a little more frequently than monthly, perhaps, just to catch back up. But we'll know more after this Catawba Water meeting today, and maybe we'll have a couple plans for y'all to consider at the next meeting. Does that sound okay? In the meantime, we'll have a planning team call with Michael and Alicia. We can update you on the results of this Catawba Water meeting today and have a better idea coming into the next June RDC meeting about what might make the most sense. Any questions? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We will meet again June 10.
So, y'all